This story was told by a relative of mine. His name was Yong, a doctor who worked at the town's dispensary. On that day, a man named Zen from the village came to see Dr. Yong for treatment. He claimed to have a tumor on his shoulder that was causing him pain, but what was even more frightening was that he claimed to hear the tumor conversing with him. Dr. Yong felt strange and asked Zen to remove his shirt so he could examine him. He had hallucinations because of his fear, but there was no such thing as a talking tumor. There was in fact a large tumor the size of a tennis ball on Zen's shoulder, which appeared to be very frightening at first glance. Dr. Yong thought it was just a flesh tumor at first glance, so the disease diagnosis was normal. Following that, he simply prescribed Zen some anti-inflammatory and swelling-reducing medications. Dr. Yong silently watched Zen's back as he took the medicine and left the clinic. He was aware that this man was infamous in town for being worthless and committing heinous crimes. It was best not to mess with him. The next day, while Dr. Yong was examining a sick woman, Zen rushed in and pushed open the door to find him. He appeared to be in a lot of pain because of the tumor on his shoulder. His trembling hands squeezed the tumor and his face was contorted and sweaty. In this situation, Zen begged Dr. Yong to heal him and relieve his pain as soon as possible. Dr. Yong also attempted a quick examination of the woman, followed by an examination of Zen. When confronted with Zen's excruciating pain, Dr. Yong couldn't help but wonder if he took medicine or not.
Doctor, I not only took it in time, but I also took twice as much medicine to make the disease go away, but it hurts more and more, said Zen.
Dr. Yong also gave up on him, but he took off Zen's shirt again to check the progress of that fleshy tumor. Dr. Yong was shocked and felt cold at the first glance of the tumor. Because the tumor doubled in size in just one day, and the surface of the tumor also faintly outlined a human face that appeared quite frightening. Because Dr. Yong had never seen these symptoms before, he had no idea how to treat it. Following that, he advised Zen to go to a specialized hospital for examination and treatment. Zen, on the other hand, seemed to find something hard to say and refused to go to the specialized hospital as well. Zen now feared that Dr. Yong would think he didn't have any money and refused to treat him. He rummaged through his pockets for money in the hope of being treated. He took a large sum of money from his pocket and presented it to the doctor. Zen would pay any amount as long as Dr. Yong agreed to treat him. When Dr. Yong saw the large sum of money, he became suspicious of Zen. Because he was an unemployed, poor man who couldn't even afford to buy food. As a result, this sum could only be obtained by breaking the law. Faced with large sums of money, Dr. Yong dared not accept Zen's treatment because he had no idea how to treat it at all. However, Dr. Yong has seen similar cases in his practice, and the cause was infection. Dr. Yong immediately inquired as to what Zen had done to become infected. Zen immediately expressed confusion and concern and then stammered that he had done nothing wrong. Dr. Yong continued to question Zen and express concern, but Zen refused to tell the truth. He quickly took back the money and adjusted his shirt and exited without saying anything else. Based on Zen's reaction, Dr. Yong could conclude that he did something bad to get this disease. After 3 days, Zen did not return to the clinic. Late at night, as Dr. Yong was about to close the door and go to sleep, someone came looking for him. There was a pounding on the door as if there was an emergency. Because Dr. Yong was the only doctor in the small town, he frequently saw patients who needed immediate medical attention. He rushed to open the door for the patient without hesitation. Unexpectedly, the person who knocked on the door was Zen, who appeared to be unable to bear this pain any longer. He couldn't keep calm and rushed to grab Dr. Yong's shoulder, his face flushed with fear. He then knelt and begged Dr. Yong to remove the tumor because he couldn't take it any longer. When Zen noticed the doctor was not responding, he burst into tears and begged the doctor to try to save him. Dr. Young felt sorry for Zen and invited him into the house, where he asked him to remove his shirt and examined him. The tumor on Zen's shoulder had grown very large at this point, and above it was a very clear and frightening human face. At this point, Dr. Young advised him to tell the truth in order to determine the root of the problem and develop an effective treatment. After being questioned repeatedly by the doctor, Zen began to hesitate and stuttered the truth. Zen finally admitted that the disease was caused by a corpse scratching him on the shoulder. He also began to explain the reason, saying that he didn't have enough money to buy alcohol, so he had to find a part-time job to make ends meet. While hoeing the field, Zen unintentionally dug up some buried bricks. When Zen noticed this, he continued to dig and clear the surrounding soil. A large block of bricks revealed on his sight. Zen discovered a cellar below after attempting to extract the brick from the ground. He couldn't help but become excited and bent down to see what was beneath. Below, it looked like an ancient tomb, completed with an old coffin and a few broken jars. Because it was dark inside, Zen had to shine a flashlight and descend to the tomb via a wooden ladder. The tomb was about 3 or 4 square meters wide, with nothing notable other than a few old vases. A piece of board was placed in the center, and the top was covered with a layer of straw and an old cotton blanket. Zen came closer, a happy smile on his face, because there was a dry hand in front of him with a very bright and beautiful jade bracelet on it. Knowing the bracelet was valuable, Zen approached and removed it from the corpse's hand. When illuminated by a flashlight, the bracelet emitted such a beautiful turquoise light. Zen was overjoyed and stuffed the rope into his pocket. He also thought that if he sold the bracelet, he would definitely make a lot of money. He was eager to climb out of the grave when he suddenly felt someone behind him. The corpse had already stood up, then approached Zen and grabbed his shoulder with a hand to pull him back. Zen was so scared. He pushed the hideous thing away and quickly climbed out of the grave. When he got home, he suddenly felt that his shoulder was very painful, and when he checked again, he found many large scratches. Then the scratches began to spread, swollen and redden. Zen honestly told all the details without daring to hide a word, just hoping the doctor could quickly cure him. Dr. Young was shocked to hear that. He did not believe that corpses could stand up on their own and know how to injure people. Seeing that the doctor did not say anything, thinking that he didn't want to help, Zen once again bowed his head and begged. Dr. Young rushed to help Zen up and said that although he couldn't cure Zen's illness, he knew someone who could. The doctor immediately told Zen to go home and wait for him to find someone who could help him. Zen immediately returned home, and Dr. Young had to scour the town in the middle of the night to find someone he thought could cure Zen's illness. The person found by Dr. Young was a traditional Chinese medicine doctor. This man had also previously treated a variety of strange diseases. Dr. Young was concerned that Zen would be unable to bear it, so he urged the old doctor to go faster. When the doctor arrived at Zen's house and knocked on the door several times but received no response, he immediately tried to push it with his hand and discovered that the door wasn't locked. Dr. Young walked inside with the old doctor and called out to Zen, but he didn't respond. Dr. Young had a bad feeling in his heart. As he guessed, the smell of blood hit him as soon as he pushed the door open. There was a large pool of blood on the ground, as well as a corpse and a sharp knife. Zen was dead, and a large chunk of flesh had been gouged out of his shoulder. Zen removed the tumor on his shoulder by himself because it was too painful. The strange thing was that the tumor's face had been completed and was even clearer than 3 hours ago. It even had a strange smile. They'd both been practicing medicine for a long time, but the feeling of discomfort and nausea they got when they saw the scene was indescribable. After Zen's death, Dr. Yang summoned the police to remove Zen's body. They also searched the area where Zen discovered the tomb but found no strange traces, so the case and illness remain unexplained. Dr. Chan was well known in the area for his healing skills and knowledge of all diseases. One day, he received a very serious invitation from a farmer's house in the village. Following the tour guide, he walked for more than 20 minutes to reach the place. According to the guide, his father seemed to be in a critical condition. "Hurry up, doctor. My father can't take it anymore." Arriving in front of the house, the man opened the old gate and invited Dr. Chan inside. As he led the doctor inside, he hurriedly called out to his mother. "Mother, I invited Dr. Chan to come here." The mother had just come out, repeatedly urging him in because she was afraid that her husband's condition would not make him last long. The mother invited Dr. Chan inside while talking about her husband's situation. Her husband just got sick 2 days ago and was getting worse very quickly. The person lying on the bed was an older man with a pale face and wide open mouth and eyes rolled backwards. Dr. Chan approached to examine the man's situation. The older man rolled his eyes, panicking and continuously shouting,
It hurts so much. They are crawling all over me. Please kill me. I'm in so much pain.
A blanket covered the older man, so Dr. Chan didn't know what the man's problem was. So Dr. Chan decided to come and see what was under the blanket. But when he approached, the man strongly reacted to Dr. Chan. He pushed Dr. Chan away. It seemed that the disease had made the man panic and no longer aware of his surroundings. But with his years of experience, Dr. Chan quickly convinced the man to be examined. Despite following the doctor's orders, the older man still seemed to be very uncomfortable and afraid. As soon as he lifted the blanket, Dr. Chan was amazed to see the patient's current condition. The older man's belly was monstrously bulged. Suddenly, the older man appeared to be in pain, as if just moving could make his whole body suffer. Dr. Chan now seemed to understand the older man's condition, so he told the older man's son and wife to hold him tightly. Both of them joined forces to be able to hold the older man down, even though he was struggling with pain. After the older man was held tightly, Dr. Chan unbuttoned the older man's shirt, revealing a tight, swollen abdomen full of veins and blood. Dr. Chan now looked thoughtfully at the large and protruding belly of what looked like tendons. They were all very large and swollen on the skin of the older man's abdomen. But strangely, these tendons could move, or rather, it looked like worms or parasites inside of him. Dr. Chan seemed to have understood the problem. He turned to take out the acupuncture needles from the toolbox. The needles were long and sharp, but Dr. Chan believed that they could definitely help the older man now. Dr. Chan just stopped thinking for a moment, then started his treatment. Acupuncture needles were inserted into the older man's belly in sequence. Dr. Chan was very good at this acupuncture method. After a while, acupuncture needles were quickly inserted all over the man's belly, and the things that looked like worms also started to stop moving. And a few minutes later, they disappeared completely, no longer visible on the skin of the older man's belly. The older man now also began to calm down, feeling less pain, and was able to rest for a while. The son seemed very worried about his father. He hurriedly asked Dr. Chan what strange illness his father was suffering from. Dr. Chan did not talk directly about the disease at this time, but he began to learn more about the time the older man got sick. Dr. Chan said to the son, "Your father had been infected with a type of poisonous parasite. If left for any longer, it would consume all of his organs. The situation is very dire." The son asked Dr. Chan if his father would be saved. The wife also said that her husband suddenly became strange a few days ago after cutting grass to feed the cows. That's when he began to feel sick. Upon hearing that, Dr. Chan quickly asked her about the location of the lawn, as he wanted the patient's family to lead him there to check it out and inspect. According to his mother's description, the son also knew the location of the lawn area. By the time it was getting dark, the son had already started taking Dr. Chan because it was around wild grass growing relatively far from their home. On the way, the son still didn't understand why his father's illness had something to do with the wild grass. But Dr. Chan still didn't explain anything. He had his own conclusions. After walking quite a distance, the son said they were almost there. They just have to go behind the cliff and they would arrive. When he arrived, Dr. Chan was amazed and also afraid. It seemed that his suspicions were correct. In front of them was a bunch of weeds, as tall as people and at first glance, as normal as any other type of weed. Dr. Chan and the son started to walk closer to the grassy area. The doctor was extremely wary, but the son didn't know what was going on. Dr. Chan walked and looked around like he was looking for something. Finally found what he was looking for. Seeing that they had been gone for quite a long time from home, and with the doctor being extremely quiet without telling him about his father's condition, the son began to worry. At this point, Dr. Chan began to explain to the son the cause of the appearance of the parasites. A parasite caused his father's illness. They were infecting and sucking blood from his father's belly fat. The parasite was born from a strange worm, and it only reproduced on this type of weed. After that, Dr. Chan started rummaging through his tool bag. The son still didn't understand what Dr. Chan was going to do. Then Dr. Chan gave the son a thick scarf that looked like it was sewn with many layers. The two began to approach the weeds, and Dr. Chan needed to experiment a bit to be sure to find something that could treat the patient. After a while of searching, Dr. Chan reached out and picked a branch of the tree which grew among the weeds. Indeed, if they looked at it with the naked eye, it would be difficult to distinguish this plant in the middle of a vast lawn. Even the son was very surprised. Dr. Chan held up the branch high and asked the son to look closely above the small leaves, which were the eggs of the parasites. At this point, the son was starting to get scared but still wanted to know what it was, so he also looked at the leaf. And indeed, on the surface of the leaves, there were some seeds, tiny as white as a grain of rice. When he tried to take a closer look, the son suddenly realized that they were eggs and covered with thin membrane-like spider silk. The son wondered, this thing was so small, how could it cause such a terrible disease? Dr. Chan didn't explain much. He just asked the son to take a good look at what he does next. Dr. Chan rummaged through his pocket and pulled out a small vial. Then he gave it to the son, telling him to apply it on his face and hands. Applying this drug would help avoid insects, even those parasitic larvae that attacked the body. After that, Dr. Chan started going deep into the grass, like he was looking for something. The weeds around here were taller than a person's head, so there was a lot of potential for danger. In the end, it seemed that Dr. Chan had found something important that could help cure the older man's illness. After reaching out to pick a tree branch, Dr. Chan showed it to the son. There were many small purple fruits on the branch, which looked very strange. Dr. Chan held it out in front of the son and told him to look for more fruits like this. It grew from the same tree on which the poisonous parasites lay their eggs. Dr. Chan told him to look carefully and pick a lot to bring back to save his father. The two began to split up to find and pick the strange fruit which only reproduced on this plant, and only its fruit could kill those parasites. In just a moment, the two were able to pick a lot of fruit. After getting out of the weeds, Dr. Chan suddenly took a small knife and cut a small cut on his finger. The son was extremely surprised but still very quiet, watching Dr. Chan. Next, Dr. Chan began to drip his own blood from the cut. The drop of blood fell directly onto the leaf containing the small larva eggs. At this moment, the son was putting the leaf on the handkerchief and holding it in his hand. What happened next made him extremely scared. After the drop of blood permeated the egg sacs, they seemed to begin to move. From within the tiny eggs, strange creatures looking like small worms began to break the egg sac and came out. At first, they were just bigger than a thread, but after they sucked all the blood on the leaf, they suddenly became as big as chopsticks. They gradually got bigger and bigger. In an instant, they almost filled out the entire handkerchief the son was holding, making him shiver with fear. At that moment, Dr. Chan took the purple fruit he had just picked. He gently squeezed the fruit and it immediately oozed a purple liquid. After that, he directly dripped it onto a parasite. Miraculously, the purple juice from the wild fruit worked. The poisonous parasite began to writhe in pain and then withered and died. Seeing these things, the son also understood what the doctor wanted to say. Suddenly, Dr. Chan seemed to remember something. He glanced at these weeds and thought for a moment. But now, it was getting dark. They needed to go home with this pile of purple fruit quickly. The doctor did not forget to ask the son if anyone had known this lawn area, and Dr. Chan began to worry when he looked closely at the weeds behind him. He was worried that if he continued to leave this lawn and this dangerous plant here, more people would be harmed. So Dr. Chan asked more carefully if this land was owned by anyone or not. Because the older man's condition was critical, they didn't talk much but quickly went home to treat him. Arriving home, Dr. Chan gave the bunch of plants to the wife and told her to get a basin and squeeze all the juice of these purple fruits into it. After squeezing the juice, Dr. Chan began to pull out all the needles that had been inserted into the older man's belly in the first place. Within those purple fruits seemed to be a lot of liquid, so a full basin was squeezed out. Dr. Chan said to the wife, "Take this wet towel and wipe your husband all over his body." This method would cause pain to the parasites and was intended to force the parasites out of the patient. Following Dr. Chan's instructions, the wife quickly wiped it all over her husband and then they allowed a few minutes so that the purple juice could penetrate the skin. A few minutes later, when the time came, Dr. Chan held a small scalpel. He cut an extended cut on the patient's wrist. This would be the way for the parasites to escape. And yes, after the purple water had penetrated into the skin, the parasites began to ache and increasingly wiggle beneath the older man's skin. They were crawling around and seemed to be looking for a way to get out. The sight was terrifying. Witnessing what happened in front of their eyes, the wife was terrified, wondering if her husband could stand it. Seeing that Dr. Chan tried his best to comfort her, everything would be resolved soon. At this point, the parasites began to appear all over the older man's body. It turned out that they had proliferated a lot in his stomach and were now trying to crawl out. The parasites eventually discovered the cut on the older man's wrist, so they started making their way there. In an instant, they began to crawl out from the wound on the older man's wrist. The scene was gruesome. Long parasites like worms were jostling to escape the older man's body. At a glance, these parasites were fat and red. It seemed that they had sucked a lot of blood from the older man's body. And after only a few minutes, all the parasites came out from the mouth of the wound. Underneath the floor, Dr. Chan also left a basin of purple fruit juice, so they fell straight into it. The purple juice began to work, directly killing those fat parasites. They withered and decomposed utterly, leaving only a pungent stench like the smell of carrion. After the parasites had all escaped, the older man's body started returning to normal. Dr. Chan turned back and informed the son and his mother that his father was out of danger. Dr. Chan advised a few more things to take better care of the older man. After a few days of rest, he would get better. After that, Dr. Chan also said goodbye to the older man's family because he needed to handle something important. Because he already had a plan in mind, Dr. Chan decided to deal with this problem decisively. Otherwise, many more people would be harmed by this poisonous parasite. That night, Dr. Chan walked towards the weed area in the afternoon. He lit a fire and burned it all. He hoped that no one would be accidentally infected with this blood-sucking parasite ever again. This is a story that my grandmother told me. The story begins with a villager named Suzu. He was well known for being a gifted and precise hunter. He could kill any animal in his sight with a single shot. Suzu had more than 30 years of hunting experience. Every prey that was targeted by Suzu found it difficult to escape. Every time he went hunting in the mountains, he brought home a trophy. Sometimes it was small prey, like rabbits, foxes and weasels, and other times it were much larger prey like deer and wild boar. At the same time, Suzu's wife gave birth to a lovely son named Kido. "The boy is as smart as his father," Suzu proclaimed. But the unfortunate thing was that as the child grew older, everyone realized he was a bit challenged. The village children of Kido's age refused to play with him because they thought Kido was stupid. But as the boy's parents, Suzu and his wife adored him, even if he was a bit dumpy, as the others would say. He was still their child. Sometimes, when they couldn't sleep in the middle of the night, they talk about their struggling son and plan ways to improve his future. But what they worried about that day and night was who would be able to care for Kido after they died. It was rumored that Suzu had killed too many lives over the years, so naturally vengeance was handed out to their family. That was why Suzu finally decided to put the shotgun away and stop hunting. 20 years later, when Suzu decided to return to a more honorable way of doing business, making a living by being an honest farmer, Kido was nearly 30 years old. The elderly couple died in turn. Their only regret being that they were unable to help provide a family for Kido. So, after Suzu and his wife died, Kido was alone in the world. Even though Kido was 30 years old at that time, he couldn't take care of himself, not even for a meal. He was able to avoid starvation thanks to the generosity of his neighbors. Since then, the Lee family's kitchen had been ice cold. During that cold winter, snow fell for a long time and became increasingly dense, making travel difficult and food scarce. Kido became seriously ill because he lacked warm clothing at the time. Neighbors couldn't even take care of him at that period. Days passed when there was a knock on the door. A woman's silhouette appeared, carrying a rattan basket. It was a beautiful woman. She stated that she knew Suzu's father and had been asked to come here to care for him. Her name was Yon. The first thing Yon did when she came in was to prepare porridge for Kido. Her presence made the house feel cozier. Finally saved, only 2 days later, thanks to her dedicated care, his illness was completely cured only 2 days later. Jon had stayed at Kido's house since then, washing, cooking and caring for the special young man on a daily basis. In the countryside, stories like this quickly spread around every corner, becoming the topic of conversation among neighbors in their spare time. Many people were happy for Kido because now he had someone who could look after him. However, many people speculated about Jon's unusual appearance. The majority of people thought it was a good predestined relationship. Kido was silly, but in return he had honesty and good working ability, and Jon was a girl who was both beautiful and responsible. In the second year following Jon's arrival in the Lee family, everyone in the village took the place of Kido's parents to assist him in organizing a simple wedding ceremony for him and Jon. Everyone was happy for Kido. Before, no one ever imagined that one day he would have a wife, especially such a beautiful bride. The newlyweds' happy days passed peacefully in this manner, but then something tragic happened one day. That day, Kido went to the fields with his tool as usual. There was a group of young gangsters in the village who had been keeping a close eye on Kido and Jon for quite some time. In the past, they frequently took advantage of Kido's lack of intelligence to play tricks on him and make fun of him. But now, seeing a stupid person like him marrying such a beautiful wife, they were jealous. They were so jealous that their eyes turned red. But what else could they do since Kido and Jon was already married? "Throw pearls to the pigs," they said bitterly. But, come what may, when jealousy was at its peak, taking advantage of the fact that Kido had left the house, they had bad intentions for Jon right away. They all went to Kido's house because they knew Jon was alone at home right at that moment. At the same time, Jon was hanging clothes in the yard. Hearing the knock on the door, she thought that the neighbors had something to ask for as usual, and besides, it was daylight, so she didn't take any precautions. Jon was wary as soon as the door was ajar and she saw the three men. But now they were using the excuse of bringing an injured Kido home to persuade her to open the door. The door swung open. Outside, there was no injured Kido, despite what they claimed. Instead, only the three thugs with despicable faces. "Hello, beautiful." Jon quickly realized she was in a dangerous situation. One of them took a step forward and grabbed her wrist. After barbaric laughter, they proudly dragged her inside. Jon was dragged away involuntarily because her strength couldn't be compared to three adult men. Jon screamed angrily and held Kido's name in terror. Meanwhile, Kido was working in the field. Suddenly, his tool's handle snapped, as if by premonition. Despite his lower intelligence, he had a vague sense that something was wrong, and he felt unusual discomfort in his heart. All he could think about was Jon, his wife. Kido dashed home immediately without much thought. Despite Jon's frantic resistance, the three thugs successfully forced her to lie on the bed inside the house after a long struggle. Jon's face changed abnormally while she was struggling with despair. Patches of brick-colored hair gradually appeared on both sides of her face, and her teeth sharpened as well. The thugs had noticed the anomaly as well. They appeared terrified, but it was all too late. When Jon waved a hand, one of the thugs' faces appeared splattered with blood and covered with deep scratches. In front of them was now a fox. Terrified, the other two thugs fled. Outside, Kido also just returned. When he saw someone fleeing from his house, He knew they had gotten into trouble with Jan. Kido might not be very smart, but he had tremendous strength. In a fit of rage, he swung up and smacked the thug in the middle of the forehead, who died instantly on the spot, in a pool of his own blood. He witnessed a horrifying scene as soon as he ran into the house. Jan was launching an attack on one of the other two thugs. He became completely immobile. Hearing the sounds, Jan turned around, blood still stuck to the corner of her mouth on her fox-transformed face. Jan calmed down as she saw the person approaching was Kido. Her face, as usual, changed back into a beautiful appearance instantly. But strangely, Kido was not afraid of his wife's appearance. He trusted her because he knew she wouldn't hurt him. The injured thug recovered after being terrified by Jan's transformation. He grabbed his face and bolted as fast as he could, yelling aloud that there was a demon inside the house. Jan was unconcerned about the last surviving thug. She asked Kido to bring the bodies of the other two into the house. She finished the job and sat cross-legged on the bed facing the two corpses. In the meantime, a faint blue light emanated from both of her hands. Kido sat to one side, intently watching his wife's movements. The two blue lights in her hands slowly flew forward, landing one after the other on top of the corpses. It was magic. The two thugs leaped to their feet as soon as the blue light vanished. They somehow came back to life. Kido was taken aback. How could the dead be brought back to life? Jan, on the other hand, explained that they had been resurrected, but were no longer human. She purposefully implanted two souls of both a cat and a dog into their bodies. Jan began telling Kido everything. In fact, she was a fox fairy who, out of gratitude, incarnated in human form to care for Kido. Jan's grandmother was saved by his father, Suzu, during a hunting trip 20 years ago. She was caught in an animal trap set by other hunters at the time. In return for Suzu's kindness, Jan's grandmother asked her to take care of his son after he died. As for the escaped thug, he went everywhere since that day to tell everyone that Jan was some kind of a demon. But sadly, no one believed him. Everyone thought he was insane. The other two didn't fare much better. One guy was always climbing up the walls to lie on and bask in the sun like a cat, while another guy specialized in rummaging through trash cans everywhere looking for leftovers like a dog. Time continued in this manner until Kido finally passed away at the age of 51. Jan was in charge of his funeral and burial arrangements. She then shut the door and began walking down the road towards the mountain. Jan left with a rattan basket in her hand, just like the day she went to Kido's house that cold winter. Many people said she hadn't aged at all after living with Kido for so long. As a result, they gradually began to believe the thug's words, believing that she was indeed a transforming fox elf. The ghost wedding was a type of marriage ceremony of the afterlife which appeared before the Han Dynasty in China. It was the betrothal of an unmarried person to a deceased person as husband or wife. In my village in the 90s, I heard a story related to this ghost wedding. In the village, there was a girl named Fang. Fang had an older brother. Because of her family's poverty, her mother married her to a dead man to get money for her brother's marriage. Their family was wealthy, but they only had one son, Sin. Sin had been sick since childhood. A monk said that Sin would not live to be 20. Sin lived to be 25, but his condition worsened shortly after his birthday. He went to many doctors, but they all refused to treat him. Then Sin passed away, but he was not buried. His parents bought a girl to have a wedding with him. The chosen one was Fang, but ever since Fang married Sin, strange things kept happening. The day Fang's wedding took place, no one attended because Sin's parents didn't want many people to know. After performing strange rituals in the church room, it was already dark. Then Sin's parents took Fang to Sin's room and went out. After a long wedding day, Fang felt tired. She took off her wedding dress, lay on the bed and fell asleep. In her sleep, Fang suddenly felt like someone was around her. A cold hand was touching her. Fang was awakened by that cold hand. When she opened her eyes, she saw a man sitting by the bed. She felt that the man was very familiar, but she couldn't remember. The man suddenly said, "Don't be surprised. I am Sin. You are my wife now." Fang heard the man say that. In her heart, she did not believe, because how could Sin come back to life? Sin looked at Fang and flashed a ghostly smile. He said, "Of course I am dead, and now I am just a soul." At this moment, Fang saw the altar picture behind Sin. The man in front of her was exactly like the person in the photo. She couldn't believe they were the same person. That made Fang only have one thought in her mind, that he was a ghost. Fang screamed and fainted. Early in the next morning, Fang woke up feeling aching all over her body. She saw the blood on the bed and remembered what happened last night. She thought someone had faked Sin and tricked her into losing her virginity, because how could the dead come back to life? After thinking about it, she dared not tell her husband's parents that she had been tricked into losing her virginity on the first day of marriage. Because if this got out, she didn't know how she would live. Her husband's family was very good to her. Every day they all nourished her. Fang didn't have to do any work because they were afraid she would get tired. But the better they treated her, the more guilty she felt. So, it had been more than 4 months since Fang got married and stayed in their house since Sin passed away. Fang was more and more scared because her belly was getting bigger and bigger. She didn't know how to explain it. But when they saw Fang's belly, they were not only not angry, on the contrary, they were very happy. Fang turned from fear to curiosity. One day after having dinner, Fang felt so bored. Therefore, she walked around the house alone. As she reached the corner of the street, she saw 2 women talking. When Fang heard them talk about her, she hid against a wall and listened to the story. It turned out that Fang's strange marriage and a pregnant belly had become the matter of discussion. Fang felt very uncomfortable hearing them talk about her. Fang was sad when the 2 women talked about her growing belly. They said that it was most likely a ghost fetus. Fang was horrified to hear this. She didn't know and didn't understand what a ghost fetus was. Suddenly, she remembered the scene on the first night of marriage. Was it really Sin that came back that night? Fang did not dare to listen to the story of those 2 women anymore. She desperately walked home and was so scared that she didn't know what she was carrying. Fang returned home, her heart heavy. She didn't pay attention to the greetings of her husband's parents and went straight to her room. Then she climbed right into bed and fell into a deep sleep. While fast asleep, Fang heard the door creak from outside. A cold wind rushed in and Fang was startled awake. She sat up and looked at the door. At this moment, Fang could see clearly that a shadow had come in front of her. Fang saw the shadow that was Sin, her dead husband. Fang heard Sin's confession about himself. With more anxiety in her heart than fear, Sin was not as fierce as before and very polite. He stood by the bed and kept his distance from Fang, but Fang felt many doubts. Fang still didn't believe Sin was dead. Sin turned to go to the window and began to tell the story. Sin had been sick since childhood. The family sought many remedies, many healers to cure him, but to no avail. When Sin was 15 years old, a man claiming to be a monk could help him continue his life by following the monk to study religion. Sin's parents loved him very much, but because they wanted Sin to live a few more days, they let him follow the monk. Time flew. 3 years had passed in the blink of an eye. Sin's parents were very worried and always waited for his return. Suddenly one day Sin returned. The couple was happy to see him. However, no matter what his parents asked Sin, he did not tell them where he had gone during those years. After that, Sin passed his 20th birthday. His parents were happy to see that his face was rosier than before, but Sin had very strange expressions. His father saw that Sin was not happy. He was worried about Sin's illness, so he asked. When Sin said that he would not live to 25 years old, his father immediately felt worried. Sin looked at his father as if remembering something. He began to explain to his father. The old monk helped him improve his physical strength, but it was limited to 25 years old. The monk said when Sin was over 25 years old, he would die. Sin had hoped that when he died, his parents could find someone to marry him. If the wife agreed to enter the wedding chamber within the first 7 days, she would give birth to a son for his family. When Fang heard this, she was completely dumbfounded. It turned out that Sin was a ghost. He didn't lie to her. Fang picked up the pillow and threw it at Sin, but the pillow passed through Sin's body. Sin was not angry but happy to tell Fang his true purpose. Sin wanted to use the ghost fetus in Fang's belly so that he could be reincarnated as a human. At this moment the door was kicked open. Fang and Sin simultaneously looked towards the door. It was the old monk. At that time Sin stopped studying and returned because he couldn't stand the hardship. However, he had stumbled across the resurrection method in the monk's room. When he saw Fang's stomach, the monk understood what had happened and was very angry. According to Sin, the monk did not want to save him because the monk did not tell him about this method. Meanwhile, the monk knew that Sin's heart was not good, so he soon lost his way. Sin didn't believe in the old monk. He thought the monk had a good method, why not show him early? Knowing that Sin couldn't be stopped, the old monk was determined to destroy Sin's ghost to save Fang. The monk drew a spell in the air and pushed towards Sin. Sin tried to escape, but he found his legs couldn't move. Sin saw 4 small ghosts appear on him. They held Sin so he couldn't move. At this moment the old monk walked towards Sin, took out a piece of charm paper and stuck it on his forehead. Seeing black smoke on his head, Sin was very scared in his heart. The old monk went to Fang. He wanted to save her before the ghost fetus was completely formed. Fang felt very scared now, and without consulting her, the monk took out a piece of charm paper, mumbling something. After reciting the spell, the talisman in the monk's hand also spontaneously caught fire. Then the monk said a sentence. The bowl of water on the table flew into his hand. The old monk stuffed the talisman paper into the bowl. The water in the bowl caught fire. Fang was afraid and covered her eyes. When the fire was extinguished, the water in the bowl turned red. The monk said that if Fang just drank this bowl of water, the ghost fetus in her belly would be destroyed. Fang fainted on the bed after drinking the bowl of water, and a black liquid came out from Fang's lower part. At this time the monk looked back at Sin. Sin was weak and fading. He angrily cursed at the monk. The old man walked towards Sin, holding a wooden sword in his hand as if he wanted to finish Sin directly. At this time, Sin's mother heard and rushed to intervene. When the monk did not notice, A mother's hand suddenly snatched the talisman from Sin's forehead. As soon as the energy that suppressed him disappeared, Sin turned into a gust of wind and fled. The monk knew that Sin's mother loved Sin very much, so even though he was enraged, the old monk still ignored it, and then he left without looking back. Sin's father and mother looked at the door, crying until their tears ran dry. They knew it was wrong to love their son that way and felt sorry for their son and sorry for Fang. The next day, Sin's parents moved away with Fang. No one knew where they went, but everyone noticed that Fang's belly wasn't that big anymore. This story is about a real estate agent named Higo. Today he had an important meeting with a wealthy landlord. The landlord rushed to greet him as soon as he entered the house and thoughtfully poured tea to invite him. Higo approached him shyly and inquired briefly about the mansion. Two people talked about the contract and the commission agreement as well as the selling price. Despite the fact that the decision had been made, the owner seemed to be depressed. Higo didn't pay much attention to that. The only thing he was concerned with was the profit that he would earn. He presented the owner with a completed contract and waited for a response. Meanwhile, the mood in the living room had deteriorated. Higo felt a shivering sensation all of a sudden. The door to the living room burst open when he turned back slightly to have a look. He inquired innocently of the landlord about the state of the facilities, infrastructure, and quality of this villa in order to conduct an evaluation, but the owner was unconcerned, simply stating that he was willing to sell at whatever price Higo deemed reasonable. Higo was taken aback by this. Suddenly, he heard a strange sound outside of the corridor. Before Higo could ask what was going on, the landlord handed him the contract and explained what needed to be revised before asking when he could resume signing. Higo received the contract, carefully memorized the customer's request, and then quickly left. The owner also sent him to the door. On the way to the door, he noticed cold air coming from this house as if something strange was going on. Apparently, he had a feeling that this landlord was concealing something from him. He moved his gaze to a small corner of the living room. Some old toys for children had been left in the corner. Higo found it difficult to comprehend, but then he set aside the story about this house and strolled out leisurely. A cold breeze blew lightly on his back as he approached the gate. Higo had the impression that someone was staring at him. He then turned his head to look again at that house. When he turned around, there was a tiny shadow standing at the upper window. The face appeared of a little boy with dark eyes and pale skin. Higo looked at him with surprise, sensing that something was wrong. The landlord told him that he didn't have a wife or child. How come there was a boy standing there? But he soon discovered that his concern was futile. So Higo walked straight to the gate to continue his work, where the boy silently watched him. It was strange that he had just left the villa not long ago. The landlord called him back with a very urgent attitude, demanding that he wanted to conclude the contract as soon as possible. Higo returned to the villa for his client. He stood in front of the house and gently rang the bell, but it took a long time for the old landlord to respond. He had been waiting outside for a long time. He banged on the door and shouted loudly because his instincts told him that something bad had happened, but it didn't work. He discovered that the door was not locked while knocking. He pushed in curiously, wondering where this old man could go. Why the landlord didn't lock the door if he went out. Back into the room, he heard painful groans of the landlord calling his name. The landlord appeared covered in blood in front of him. Something slashed across his back, and he was running to Higo in fear, looking for help. He landed on Higo's body. Higo picked up the old man reflexively. asking him what had just happened. The old man hummed. Extreme panic said that someone wanted to kill him. Higo had a chance to look behind the landlord when he fell on him, but it was a lot stranger than he thought. Behind him was an empty room with no one, no footprints, and no indication that anyone other than the owner was present. He panicked and rushed the old man to the hospital. Fortunately, the injury was minor, and he regained consciousness within a few minutes. His entire body was wrapped in white bandages, and tired eyes stared at him. When Higo asked him about the incident, his eyes revealed a little sadness and remorse. The old landlord called Higo to stand closer to him, and then sorrowfully told him the whole story, beginning with a bad decision he made a year ago. He was a failed businessman at that time. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy. All of the projects he invested in had failed completely, that he ended up empty-handed. During a drink with a friend, he was tipped away to save the business, a very useful trick he picked up while traveling in Thailand. That was to invite Kumantong to worship in his home. The infant demon was a dread fetal body that was placed in a statue, then cast a spell to calm the soul so that it could stay in this world to save and bless the adoptee who was considered to be his biological parents. Because he was poor and stuck at the time, he listened to his friend and traveled to Thailand to request a statue of an infant demon to worship at home. At the beginning, everything came true. The devil provided him with whatever he desired. Money kept pouring into his pocket. His previous partners had rejected him before, now also back to collaboration. Sometime later he met a beautiful young woman. The two quickly married. Not long after that, the wife became pregnant. The doctor on the ultrasound said it was a healthy boy. During the pregnancy, the wife always had a feeling of something very insecure, especially when she passed the altar of the devil that he placed in the house. One time the wife was passing by the altar of the Kumantang. She slightly looked up at the altar. In a sudden, she saw the demon's face changed, staring at her. She told her husband about this, but he not only didn't care, he also considered it as a joke. Because she couldn't sleep, the wife went down to the stairs alone as if someone made her do it. Just a few steps, a great force behind her slammed into her back. Panicked, she turned her head to see what was standing behind her. She saw the infant demon standing on the stairs, looking at her, killing sight in his eyes. She fell down the stairs, slamming her body into the ground. She was unconscious and bleeding profusely. After that, she not only couldn't keep the pregnancy, but she also lost her ability to become pregnant again. The couple started to fight from there. He couldn't hold on to that broken marriage any longer, so he watched her leave the house with a suitcase. Since then, his career had also taken a downward turn. Losing his wife and family was devastating enough that he was unable to maintain his career. To cope with his grief, he turned to alcohol, until one day, when he returned home drunk, he looked at the Kumantang statue on the altar and became enraged. He blamed Kumantang for his life being ruined and stuck, so he raised his hand intending to smash the bottle of wine on the demon's head in order to destroy the statue, but a ray of turquoise light shot at him before he could do anything. He slammed the bottle of wine onto his head instead. Blood splattered and his head hurt like hell. He regained his composure, looking around giddily, not understanding anything. When he looked up at the altar, he noticed that the Kumantang had transformed and now was staring at him with a soft, ghostly smile. Until today, he decided to stay at home and called Higo in order to discuss about the selling of this house. While he was speaking, a sharp knife from the table rushed towards him. He was fortunate to avoid the knife's tip. but the knife cut him deeply on one of his cheeks. He unconsciously looked up at the roof and noticed the Kumanthong floating in the air. That demon was staring at him. His eyes were white and wide open, and he had a hostile expression on his face. The demon then cast a spell that caused his furniture to fly up and then threw him like a storm, rendering him unable to dodge. Yigo felt panicked after hearing the story and worried about the contract with his landlord. He said his goodbyes to the landlord and then left quietly. He kept thinking about the horror story he had just heard as he drove. He walked past a mansion that was once thought to be a big catch for him. He couldn't help but be concerned when he saw the billboard in front of the house. Yigo paused for a moment before taking a step closer. The infant demon was still looking at him from above, right at the window, but his smile had become more ghostly than ever. This is a true horror story that's well known in my hometown. At the time, there was a couple in my village who lived with their younger brother. One day, a man from the village dashed to their house and knocked on the door. The man was panicking, dashing inside and howled, "Dead! Your brother is dead!" The older brother was mortified, unable to believe what he had heard, and repeatedly asked the man to please correct himself. But this man insisted that his brother was hunting with him when he slipped and fell into a stream. The older brother and his wife were astounded to hear this. As a result, the two followed the man and hurried to the forest's edge to check on his brother's situation. When they arrived, they noticed that there were many people standing around. Everyone was talking about the accident. At the time, it was extremely difficult for the couple to get through the crowd to see how their brother was doing. On the spot, his brother was soaking wet, pale and motionless on the ground. But his eyes were still open and dreamy, staring at the couple as if clinging to life. When the couple noticed this, they rushed to assist their younger brother. The older brother pressed his ear to his brother's heartbeat hopelessly, seeing that he was still alive. Thinking that there was still a chance to save his life, the older brother and his wife brought him home. The house was now filled with the cries of the wife and the younger brother, who was now lying motionless on the bed. The couple's worry and grief were clearly visible on each person's face. All they had to do now was wait for him to take his last breath. However, a wheezing sound came from his mouth at that moment. The couple was taken aback by the expression. The couple had just turned to look at their brother when he sat up like a spring. But this time his face was very frightening and his eyes were lifeless. When the wife noticed that her brother was awake, she couldn't contain her joy and cried and called him, but he didn't answer and just sat with his back to the couple, looking very strange. Immediately after that, he crawled onto the bed and stood up awkwardly, squirming like a zombie. He walked like a child learning how to walk, his mouth still smiling with a devilish grin. But then he collapsed back on the bed. When the wife saw her brother like that, she assumed he had just drowned, so he was tired, dizzy, and couldn't stand. Concerned for his safety, she immediately ran to help him, but when she got close to him, she felt a cold from the younger brother's body. As soon as she touched his body, the younger brother turned to face his older brother and sister-in-law with a strange expression. He had a crazy smile on his face. His eyes were white and his irises were cloudy. He looked insane. After that, the younger brother jumped to the ground from the bed with all his legs and arms and ran out of the room as fast as an arrow. He dashed out, aiming for the door. The couple looked at him in surprise, not sure if it was because he was shocked by drowning and wondering where he could run to. Concerned about their brother, the couple decided to go out and find him. They both looked around the corner and called out their brother's name, but there was no response. After searching for a while, the husband discovered his brother in a garden corner performing a terrifying action. He sat in front of the chicken coop door before reaching inside and catching a large rooster. His next move surprised and shocked the couple. His mouth only smiled satisfiedly before he bared his teeth, grabbed the rooster hard and sucked its blood. Seeing his brother's scary expression, the couple rushed to hold him, but at the same time, he seemed to have become insane and difficult to control. When the husband noticed this, he stopped him, but he struggled, as if he wanted to get out. The husband, who was no longer strong enough to stop him, had to rely on his wife's assistance to bring him into the house. As if sensing something, the husband quickly wrapped a blanket around his body and tied him up with ropes. He hummed angrily like an animal, not saying anything. The wife suspected that their brother had gone insane after falling into the stream. When the wife discovered that her brother was behaving strangely, she was taken aback and questioned her husband, who showed a cold demeanor. Suddenly, the two were drawn to a strange phenomenon from their younger brother, which made them extremely scared. In front of them was no longer the usual gentle little brother, but a scary demon. His face changed dramatically, turning monstrous. His eyes turned blue and he grumbled like a demon. Because the husband knew his judgment was correct, he told his wife to stay at home to watch over his brother, while he ran to the next village to invite the shaman over to do an exorcism. Later, the husband and the shaman, who was known as the best shaman in the area, arrived at the house. The wife was standing outside and she said that she dare not go inside because he would go insane whenever he saw someone. With a thoughtful expression on his face after hearing the wife's explanation, the teacher went to observe the younger brother's situation. The husband was concerned and he was a little impatient to ask the shaman, but the shaman simply stated that his brother had died. When the wife heard it, she couldn't believe it. Why was her brother still able to move when he's dead? The shaman then asked the couple if they had recently seen a golden ferret around the house, which surprised them. After thinking for a while, the couple told the shaman that their brother had caught and killed a stray golden ferret in the yard last week. As soon as the shaman heard this, he asked the couple to bring him a pair of scissors. The wife immediately did as she was told. The husband then followed what the shaman told him, assisted his brother to stand up, and watched the shaman gently walk away to perform the spell. When confronted with the shaman, the younger brother was now screaming like a maniac. The shaman held the scissors in front of him and muttered an exorcism spell. Hearing the shaman's voice, the younger brother became more aggressive, turning around and shouting, baring his teeth to threaten the man. The strangest thing was that the younger brother did not speak any human language, but only called out in unknown voices. Seeing this, the shaman became enraged and howled angrily, "If you don't go, I will cut off your tail." He was now struggling and screaming, making it difficult for the older brother to hold him. After that, as soon as the shaman finished the spell, he grabbed something invisible in the air and cut it in front of the couple with his scissors. As soon as the action ended, the younger brother groaned as if he was in pain. Following that, his entire body trembled, his face turned purple, but his eyes were gentle and calm. After that, the younger brother writhed in agony. After a while of shaking, he stopped moaning but fell to the ground. The couple saw this, immediately ran to him, but the younger brother was lying motionless. His body was cold, and he didn't wake up. Witnessing that scene, the shaman announced with a sad voice that the young brother was gone. Then he quietly left. Both husband and wife burst into tears as they looked at the cold corpse. His brother's funeral was held in an uncomplicated manner. But ever since, there had been a golden ferret with its tail missing, running back and forth in front of the couple's house. This was a strange story of an office worker named Sam. He was the sales manager for a small office in the city center. Recently, Sam was preparing a business plan to present to his superiors. For him, this was an important step in his career, helping him to advance. As of today, it had been a week since he worked overtime. There didn't seem to be a day when he didn't come home late. When the whole office had left, Sam remained alone to continue working. He tiredly looked at the words running in front of the computer desk and then lazily, helplessly leaned back in his chair, looked up at the light bulb on the ceiling with his lethargic dark eyes from lack of sleep. Sam stretched and turned to look at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. The work seemed to be almost finished. Sam saw that, so he got up and quickly put on his coat. He put aside work for a while and went out of the office. He walked alone under the streetlights flickering on the street. As he walked, he thought about his life. After a while, suddenly his stomach rumbled. He suddenly remembered all day, because he was so focused, he still hadn't eaten anything. He turned into an alley. At the end of the street was a 24-hour convenience store. How unlucky. Today his familiar shop was closed again. The whole street was pitch black. There was only one crepe cart at the end of the street. Sam was attracted to this crepe cart. He was surprised to see the old cart placed in the dark corner. This was the first time he saw the crepe cart placed here. He breathed a sigh of relief. At least there was still a food cart for sale. He comfortably walked in front of the crepe cart, calling the seller. He waited for a while, and an old woman with a hunchback came out from the crepe cart, telling him that there was only one left. He nodded in agreement. After that, the old woman used her slow movements to make cakes for him. Looking at the old woman, he also knew that he couldn't ask for more. While making cakes, the old woman asked about his life. Sam also happily answered her. He told her about his job and the reason for coming home from work later today. He stood looking at the skillful operation of the old woman making cakes in front of his eyes, with a little interest and attraction in his heart. She poured the cake batter into the pan, coated it with a smooth layer. Her movements were very skillful, looked very pleasing to the eye. The aroma of the cake wafted up, swished across Sam's nose. He smelled the aroma in his heart, anticipating how delicious this cake was. His hand was on his stomach as if to stop the hunger that was screaming inside. While waiting, he also curiously asked the old woman why her children and grandchildren would let her stand selling this late at night alone. She smiled sadly and told him that she had no children. After that, she gave him a still, hot, fragrant crepe with a gentle and kind attitude. He politely took the cake from her hand, smiled, and happily paid. She received a large amount of money from Sam's hand. A little confused in her heart, seeing that Sam also smiled kindly at her, and gave her the change and then left. Sam could not contain his hunger, so he took a big bite of the cake, feeling the relief and relaxation in his heart. Then he turned back towards the crepe cart as if to send the old woman a compliment about the taste of the cake. But when he turned around, he was completely amazed. In front of him was a dark space. The old woman and the crepe cart also suddenly disappeared for unknown reasons, as if no one had ever sold cakes here. Sam saw this, very surprised. He ran into the alley to see where the old woman could go so quickly, but when he got there he couldn't believe his eyes. In front of him appeared a dead-end alley with no way out. At the end of the alley were litter and garbage bags. There was no sign where the old lady had gone. He found it difficult to understand how could the old woman go so fast. So he took the crepe cake in his hand, seeing it still didn't disappear, so he sure didn't see a ghost. He took a big bite. It was surprisingly delicious. not like a cake made by the devil. Sam devoured the cake in his hand and thought about the strange thing he just encountered. Then Sam also left to go home because it was already late at night. He still couldn't stop thinking about what just happened. The next day he woke up in his room. Yesterday's story about the old woman didn't matter to him anymore. He changed his clothes and hurried on his way. As he walked, he found himself daydreaming strangely about the craving he had for the taste of yesterday's cake. So he turned into a familiar alley to go to the old woman who sold him cakes last night. But for some reason this morning he did not see the old lady. Instead, the old woman's cake selling place had an old man sitting there selling corn. He looked old. Sam walked over to ask the old man a few questions. He pointed to the place where the old woman's crepe cart was, asking the old man about the whereabouts of that old woman selling crepes. The old man was surprised to ask who Sam was. Why did he go looking for the old woman? So Sam told the old man how he had met her last night. After hearing this, the old man became more and more alarmed, coldly said to Sam in a firm voice, "She passed away a long time ago." Sam couldn't believe what he heard anymore, looking at the old man in amazement. Seeing that the old man also invited Sam to sit down and tell him the story about the old woman. No one here knew that old woman. She had sold crepes here when he was young. At that time, the old woman sold cakes at the head of the street. The taste of her cakes were very delicious. It seemed that there was not a day that was not crowded in front of the crepe stall. The workers, no matter how far away, once they had eaten her cake, they had to come back again. Everyone who finished eating her cake could hear her talk and care, so the atmosphere around her cake was always full of laughter and joy. She sold from early morning until late at night. Her house was located quite far from here. After selling, she often rode home alone. No one knew where her children were. People only knew that she lived alone. She lived with a bunch of kids who didn't know if they were her grandchildren or the street kids she adopted. Every time she came home, she would bring home crepes for them. For a bunch of kids, it was the most precious gift in the world. The children received crepes from the old woman and happily shared them with each other. For her, watching them eat and drink was the greatest happiness. But that day was different from the other day. Looking at the children happily eating and playing with each other, she suddenly felt a little sad and insecure in her heart. She quietly told these children all that was necessary and said everything she wanted to say, and to say goodbye. The children heard her say that and immediately bursted into tears. They ran to hug her as if to keep her with them, not letting her leave. The scene that day made many people who witnessed it also moved to the point of pain. The next morning, whatever came would happen. Her regular customers came to her crepe cart as usual to buy cakes. The cart that day was still in the old place, but they called and she didn't answer. Everyone was curious. They went over to take a look and saw that the old woman was sitting on the ground motionless, stiff, not responding to customers like before. They frantically asked each other about the old woman's situation, worried about how she was. One of the people in the crowd looked at her and quickly called a few others to help. Everyone saw that the situation seemed serious, so they ran from the outside to check it out. Everyone looked at her in panic. The old woman was sitting curled up on the ground as usual, but this time her face was pale and stiff, and she was no longer breathing. As he spoke, the old man sadly recalled the past. He regretted when her crepe cart was no more. After listening, Sam also knew what happened last night. As he expected, he met a ghost, but only because she wanted to sell cakes. After knowing the end of the story, Sam said goodbye to the old man and continued on his way to the office, temporarily putting aside the story about the old crepe-selling lady. That time, Feng and I often went to the village to practice martial arts, but for some reason, every time the madman in the village saw us, he would chase after us with a stick and ask us to play together, so we just knew to run away. That madman kept looking at us and said that they had to kill the vampire with him. Feng and I ran a long way. Then that crazy guy didn't chase us anymore. Feng said that for some reason the madman kept talking about vampires. It had been a long time and it was just a rumor. I also heard the madman talk a lot about vampires, but I didn't know how the true story was. I thought he was talking nonsense like that because he was crazy. So Feng got a little worried and told me that many people in the village also knew about this. I was more surprised and urged Feng to tell me about it. Feng tried to recall it from his memory and then began to tell me why the madman went crazy and the scary story about the female vampire who had come to his village. 5 years ago, a very beautiful girl suddenly appeared in the village. She moved from the city to his village to work at the dispensary. Any boy in the village would admire the beauty and hot body of the girl. She dressed simply but made up her face carefully, and her gait was flexible. Anyone was attractive when looking through her dreamy eyes. Her body always gave off a faintly enchanting fragrance. No wonder there were no boys in the village who wouldn't fall in love with her. The men were infatuated when looking at her full breasts. Even her sexy round butt also made them unable to take their eyes off. One of the guys followed in this girl's footsteps and eloquently declared that he would make this girl his. The madman at that time was still a healthy young man. His name was Wang. Wang advised his friends not to tease the girl because he heard that the girl was a big boss's daughter. Hearing that, the guy said he was just saying it for fun. However, it seemed that Wang's friends had no intention of stopping teasing the girl. At that time, Wang and his friends were unemployed, so they often gathered to drink and gamble. That night, they made a date to play cards and chat while playing. Lately, suddenly, there were a lot of bad rumors about that girl. After a long time, Wang secretly loved and missed the girl, so he also had an unhappy expression when he heard about those rumors about her. While playing cards, Wang asked two friends if they spread bad rumors about the girl. Wang's friends appeared sinister and said, "She came to this town to not only work as a nurse but also to work as a lady of the night. People in this village all knew." As he spoke, he glanced at the friend next to him and asked the friend if he wanted to find the girl. So they advised Wang not to think about that girl anymore. She was just a prostitute. They also knew that Wang had a crush on the girl, but the truth was too harsh. So they invited Wang to drink at the pub to help him forget his sadness. Wang felt very sad, but he still wanted to find out the truth about this. Wang's friends saw that Wang drank so much and said that Wang should go to her house at night to see. There would be men sneaking into her house. Wang said that he would verify this for himself. While drunk, Wang's friends also uttered ridiculous words about the girl. They said that they had better come to see that girl tonight to know how she tasted. Wang heard that and became angry. He hit the table to get up. Two of Wang's friends were also surprised by Wang's attitude at this time. Knowing that Wang was too drunk, they stopped drinking. Then everyone went home. Wang walked on the street, drunk, which did not make Wang forget the unpleasant feeling when he heard words from his friends about the girl. But when he approached the girl's house, Wang suddenly saw a man standing in front of the girl's house. Not only that, but he also cordially called her name in the middle of the quiet night. Wang realized that the guy had a happy wife and children, but the fact that he was at this girl's house at midnight caused Wang a lot of suspicions. So Wang immediately chose a hidden corner and watched when that guy wasn't paying attention. Then Wang hid behind the wall, observing the relationship that the guy had with this girl. The scene in front of him was unbelievable. Could the rumor about the girl be true? Wang was angry and depressed when he saw the scene, but he still wanted to clarify this. So Wang climbed into the girl's house through the back door. Entering the courtyard, he was attracted by the light from the bedroom suddenly turned on. Wang stood outside silently, peeking in the window to see what these two were doing. Inside, the couple pounced on each other. The man put his arms around the girl. This beautiful girl was also very bold, taking the initiative to kiss this young man passionately. It was no longer a rumor. Wang had witnessed it with his own eyes. However, a few seconds later, Wang was horrified when he witnessed something very terrible. As soon as she hugged the guy, her beautiful face turned into a pale old face. Her eyes were bloodshot and fierce. Not stopping there, she also opened her mouth wide, revealing the sharp monster-like teeth, her hands tightly wrapped around the man's body. She then took a hard bite on his neck and sucked his blood. A moment later, the man's body turned white and fell to the ground. Wang saw the scene and was extremely scared, involuntarily shouted and fell back. Unexpectedly, a scream made the girl inside discover. She knew that there was an intruder in the house and had seen all her secrets. The girl heard the noise and went out of the bedroom. Wang was extremely frightened. The scary girl suddenly stopped staring at Wang with bloodshot eyes, bright red blood flowing from her mouth. Wang was so scared now that he didn't know what to do. He just knew how to knock on the door and run out of the house. Wang ran straight home, running while shouting that there was a demon. After returning home, Wang appeared to be shaken, hiding under the blanket and repeatedly saying that there were demons. Wang's parents tried to ask many doctors to examine the disease, but no matter how much they treated him, he still couldn't be cured. Wang only knew how to cover his whole body with a blanket. He burst into tears to say that the girl was a vampire. Anywhere he went and saw the woman, he all said that they were vampires. Since then, people in the village always came across a madman running everywhere and screaming. Feng told me the strange story and added that the woman also disappeared from the village after that day. I was curious to ask Feng if this story was true or not. Feng said he heard from his grandfather that the girl was a vampire who lured men to suck blood. That was why she was always young, beautiful, and immortal. While Feng was walking and telling me the stories, we accidentally saw a beautiful woman passing by. This woman caught Feng's and my attention. It had been a long time since a beautiful woman appeared in the village. I was curious. Why was this girl just like the one described in Feng's story? Her face was beautiful. Her body was also very sexy. However, I thought Feng's story was just a rumor. Not all beautiful girls were vampires. It was a story about a guy named Karma, whose eyes could see ghosts. He made a living as a shaman and earned an income with his special ability. Today it was the weekend, but someone unexpectedly appeared outside. The door was opened by Karma's friend Ken, who was living in the same house. A man with an emaciated and tired face appeared in front of Ken. He inquired whether Karma was at home, but Ken did not respond directly. Instead, he invited the visitor to come in first. Seeing the young man's awkwardness, Ken pointed to the room ahead and said that Karma was in the room. The young man entered Karma's room with a slight smile to express his gratitude to Ken. After exchanging greetings, Karma knew that the guy was working for a nightclub. He came to see him because he had a very strange dream. Due to time constraints, the young man went straight to the point and told Karma about his dream. In his dreams, He always saw a woman crying bitterly in the corner of the room. He felt sorry for the girl and planned to visit her to console her and ask her questions. But as he got closer, the woman became agitated and would come over to strangle him. The girl's expression frightened him even more. A white face with no eyes. Flesh that has rotted and peeled into patches as if it was decomposing. After listening to Karma, he felt that the woman certainly had many twists and turns. To find out more information, Karma asked the guy if she said anything. The man immediately waved his hand, indicating that he knew nothing about her. Because the man didn't dare to approach when he saw the terrifying face, he couldn't dare to ask her anything. At the time, the man came to meet Karma solely to request that he take care of the ghost as soon as possible. He didn't get a good night's sleep as a result of the nightmare. After hearing what he had to say, Karma laughed lightly and imagined that the woman had been killed unjustly and had come to see him in his dream to ask for his assistance. After hearing what had happened, the man became concerned because he had never had the courage to approach the woman and thus would not be able to assist her in resolving any injustice. Finally, Karma stood up and agreed to assist the man. Only he had the ability to communicate with the girl in the situation. The two of them immediately went out. When they were walking across the living room, Karma had the sudden desire to ask Ken to solve the problem. Ken had always been fascinated by ghosts, so when Karma asked him, he had no reason to refuse. The three of them quickly arrived at the man's bar. The bar was on the 4th floor of a building with a nightclub beneath it. Previously, the building was a hotel with a nightclub beneath it. Later, for the sake of convenience, some rooms on the 4th floor were converted into rooms for staff. After opening the door, Karma went around to assess the situation inside the room. With his special abilities, he could sense that the room was haunted. He immediately squatted in the middle of the room and scribbled some strange characters on the floor with a pen. After finishing the letters, Karma reached into his pocket and pulled out a bag of red liquid, a pair of chopsticks, and a candle. These were all tools he had learned to use in order to perform mystical rituals. When the man brought the requested bowl, Karma immediately took the bag containing the red liquid and poured it into the bowl, which he placed in the center of the pre-written letters. Then he folded the two chopsticks into a cross and placed them on top of the bowl before placing the candle on the chopsticks. As he prepared to finish the seance ritual, Karma stood up and smiled wickedly at the two confused people behind him, informing them that the woman would appear. When Karma said this, the other men's heartbeats quickened in fear. Ken, on the other hand, had complete faith in Karma, knowing that no matter how terrifying a woman's ghost was, he could handle it. The owner, on the other hand, was desperate to get rid of the girl, so even though the situation was tense, he gritted his teeth and persevered. When Karma shut all the doors and turned off the lights, the atmosphere in the room became quiet and gloomy. There was only one candle left lit in the room at the time. The light from the candle illuminated the room slightly. At the time, Karma took out a cloth puppet and tied a rope around its head. One of his hands grasped the other end of the rope, which was holding a puppet to the candle's head. The puppet's shadow was reflected on the wall by candlelight. It began as the shadow of a puppet, but after a few minutes, the shadow grew larger and moved to form an adult on its own. Ken, who witnessed the scene, was too terrified to say anything. A face began to emerge from the blank shadow. It slowly emerged from the surface of the wall, looking as alive as if it was real. The face came first, followed by the rest of the body. The young man and Ken were terrified and felt like fleeing. The sight of a woman stepping out from behind the wall was unbelievable. As for the man, his face was still stunned, unable to say anything, and he was only able to stare at the woman. Because she was the woman who appeared frequently in his dreams, the woman's expression, however, did not match the man's description. She appeared gentler and stood still, staring at Karma until he spoke first. Hearing Karma's promise to assist in restoring justice, the woman began to cry and shared her story. The woman's name was Aiku. Because of her poor family circumstances, she dropped out of school early to work in order to earn money. At the time, her mother was seriously ill and needed a sum of money to get medical treatment urgently. She went with an introduction to meet a wealthy individual who could lend her a large sum of money without charging interest. Seeing Aiku's beauty and pleading, the boss quickly agreed to loan Aiku the money and asked her to pay it back within 2 years. After that, Aiku began working around the clock in the hopes of paying off all her debts, but an incident occurred not long ago. The boss summoned Aiku to a private room one night because he needed to speak with her about something. Aiku noticed her boss blushing and knew right away that he had been drinking heavily. At the point, he motioned for her to take a seat beside him. Because Aiku couldn't refuse, she sat next to him while hearing about the debt she had from the boss. His statement caused Aiku to panic and she did not dare to look at him. According to the agreement, she would pay the full amount after 2 years, but there was no deadline to repay the debt at the time. The boss immediately laughed and pointed to the wine bottle on the table, telling her that if she drank the bottle of wine, all her debts would be forgiven. When Aiku heard his statements, she felt both happy and worried. After that, Aiku decided to pick up the bottle, tilt her head backwards and take a few drinks until the bottle ran out. Aiku's stomach became tense and uncomfortable after consuming a full bottle of wine. Nonetheless, she tried to calmly place the bottle of wine on the table and politely asked the boss to keep his promise because she had met the conditions he set. When her boss saw what was going on, he was taken aback because he had previously underestimated her. The boss believed that the money could make Aiku do whatever he wanted. He tried to seduce her into selling her body to him. Even though Aiku was inebriated and irritated by alcohol, she was fully aware. She realized her boss's intentions and became embarrassed and enraged. Because she was a kind person, she refused to sell herself for money, so she did not hesitate to slap the boss to express her displeasure. The boss's face was expressionless as he was brutally beaten, but his attitude quickly shifted, and he became enraged as a result of Aiku's actions. He couldn't keep his rage in check and immediately raised his foot, kicking Aiku to the ground. He even summoned his people to come in and beat Aiku mercilessly. After a while, the poor girl was eventually beaten to death. Despite knowing that the junior's actions went beyond their original intentions, he decided to handle her until the end. At the time, there was an empty room upstairs that was rarely used, so the boss hid Aiku's body there and converted it into a staff room. Karma couldn't help but sigh and lament the unfortunate girl. However, the fact that she knew who the enemy was without seeking vengeance in order for her to be freed made him wonder. It was not that Aiku didn't want to leave, but something in the room was keeping her from doing so. Karma did not respond. Instead, he went to the door to look around and look for the main door frame. Karma eventually found a pair of scissors on the door frame. The boss managed to seal Aiku's spirit inside the room due to his fear of retaliation from her soul. Karma turned to face Aiku, held up the scissors in his hand and told her that now there was nothing to stop her. She could do whatever she wanted. When Aiku finished listening, Aiku smiled contently. The ghost of Aiku slowly exited the room and vanished. In the next day, the young man rushed to inform Karma of the shocking news. The boss had a freak accident and went insane after being avenged by a so-called ghost girl. It was exactly what he deserved in retaliation for his crimes. Hello. I'm a mother as well as a housewife, like many other women. I have a son. His name is Yang. Fortunately, he is back to normal after a scary incident. That day, like any other day, Yang went to school and I stayed at home to cook. Even though many years had passed, everything reminds me of it. It was a very painful and sad memory. That year, I was just pregnant with Yang on the way home from the antenatal checkup. My husband and I accidentally had a severe traffic accident. My husband passed away. I was left alone, giving birth to my own child and raising him to be a responsible human. Even though my husband's death caused me great pain, seeing my healthy son being born gave me some comfort. As he got older, Yang began to act strange. Like the days we just moved into our new house, Yang kept looking into the distance. Then he would burst into tears like he just saw something unnerving. And every time that happened, there was no way to stop him from crying. Only when he would go out, he would eventually stop crying. Each time I was curious about what Yang saw because it was clear that he was just staring into an empty space in front of him. Sometimes he played alone happily. It would look like someone was playing with him, but nothing out of the ordinary was remarked. He seemed to be joking around and was very familiar with his imaginary friend. Seemed like he even had more fun than being with me. When Yang and I were playing jigsaw puzzles on the floor, Yang suddenly stopped and stared at the ceiling without saying anything. I wondered what he was looking at and asked Yang what did he saw on the ceiling. But he was incredibly focused. In return, the answer gave me chills. Someone was apparently hanging from the ceiling and seemed to want to play with him. But then again, I didn't see anything. I assumed that Yang had an imaginary friend, just like any other developing child. And that wasn't weird at all. But even when he was about to go to bed, he said that someone always lulled him to sleep every night. It became stranger by the day and made me question my sanity as I began to suspect that something strange was happening with my child. One day, when I took Yang for a walk, I met an old lady next door. The older woman looked at Yang and asked me strange questions. But the strange thing was that what she was asking was very similar to Yang's situation at that time, referring to him often talking to himself and repeatedly saying that he saw someone who was invisible to the naked eye. Suddenly, the older woman had a severe look on her face. She asked carefully about Yang's condition, whether he only saw them or was close to this invisible person. I saw the older woman's seriousness and wanted to find out about my son's situation. So I told the older woman the truth, that the boy seemed very close to that person. He even said that the invisible person sang him to sleep every night. Suddenly the older woman became alarmed. She said that if I didn't find a way to save Yang, the boy would lose his soul, get very sick, and die. She told me to call her if necessary, then gave me her phone number and left. But looking at my healthy son playing with a small dog in the distance, I doubted the older woman's words because I thought that children would always imagine invisible friends. because children were growing up, and since Yang lost his father before he was born, he might have felt lonely. I still ignored what the older woman said until that afternoon. I took Yang to the park next to the forest to have dinner because I thought it would be good for him to go out more. But suddenly Yang went straight into the forest behind us. Even when I called his name, he didn't pay attention at all and would continue going deeper into the forest. Feeling strange, I quietly followed Yang because I wanted to know what was happening to my child. A little way to the edge of the forest, Yang stopped, turned to look at me, and then began to say incomprehensible things. He said that the people inside the forest were agitated and angry because the loggers had harmed their home. They said the loggers cut down all the trees around their residence, exposed them to wind, rain, and landslides that damaged their homes. I looked into the forest, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I didn't understand what he was talking about either, so I comforted him and took him home. But I began to remember the older woman's words and felt doubtful about it all. I began to believe that the imaginary friend was not Yang's own creation. That night, after Yang went to bed, I couldn't sleep. So I grabbed my phone and scrolled through the recent news. Suddenly, a piece of news caught my eye that shocked and surprised me to the extreme. In the middle of the forest was a large cemetery. They had cut down all the trees and intended to dig up the old graves there to move to another place, and they would use that land to build high-rise buildings. And the graves had all collapsed because forest exploitation affected the environment. I suddenly remembered the words that Yang said that morning. I stood thoughtfully in front of my son's bed and started to get a little scared. If what the older woman said was true, would it be dangerous to my son? And the next day, I continued to take him out to relax. But that day he seemed very strange, not as active as usual. He suddenly became afraid of everything, always hiding behind me and saying that there were too many people around. Even looking out in the street, the boy appeared worried, because the people were crawling towards him and their faces were supposedly very scary. Finally, out of panic, Yang seemed very tired and had a cold sweat on his forehead, even though I couldn't see what he was saying at all. Seeing that Yang's condition was getting worse and worse, and he could barely raise his head to look around, I decided to take a taxi home. Sitting in the car, he got worse. His face turned purple, his sweat didn't stop dripping, and he looked so tired. Halfway there, Yang suddenly asked to get out of the car because next to where I was sitting, it seemed that someone was sitting and staring at him. According to him, that person was inviting him to go somewhere. I was extremely worried about my son, but I could only hug him or comfort him. I then called the taxi to stop so we could walk. Since this area was an area close to home, there were usually many people passing by, so I thought it would help Yang to be less afraid. But it only seemed to make things worse. The neighbor's dog was usually very fond of Yang. But that day, it also looked at my son and barked fiercely. My child seemed to be very afraid of the dog. The closer he got, the more the dog looked at Yang and barked like it could see something next to Yang. Seeing the dog act like that, I started to get even more worried, and I believed that what the older woman next door said to me might be right after all. As soon as the owner took the dog away, Yang was able to calm down and reduce his fear, while he usually would still play with the dog. When he got home, he started getting a fever. I tried everything but still couldn't help his fever. His face started to turn purple, the sweat didn't stop, and he was mumbling weird things. At this point I was too worried and had no choice but to try and call the older woman next door because I understood that my boy was not suffering from some common illness. After listening to everything she told me, the older woman showed me how to help Yang recover, but I had to believe all of it and do as she told me. Not long after, someone brought me a chicken. I wondered what was going on. Then the girl said she was from the older woman's family, and the older woman told her to bring me a chicken. And according to the older woman's advice, I had to quickly cut off the chicken's head to get blood for my son before midnight tonight. Luckily, I found the older woman in time. This was the first time I had to take a knife to cut off a chicken's head, so I was nervous and didn't dare to do it. My hands were shaking so much that I couldn't hold the knife steady. But because of my child and my husband gone, I couldn't stand the thought of losing my child. So I mustered up courage. I closed my eyes and cut down hard on the chicken's neck. Its head was cut off and blood splattered everywhere. Blood splashed all over my face and eyes, but finally it was done. Then, as the older woman instructed me, I had to take a piece of a white towel, soak the chicken's blood with it, and cover Yang's eyes with it. Then I wrapped the white cloth around the boy's head. The boy suddenly felt much better. I was also happier, and as long as I left the cloth over his eyes after midnight, everything would be fine. So I encouraged him to keep going. After midnight, I removed the towel, and he seemed to be getting better. After some time, the boy returned to normal, and it seemed he could no longer see strange things or invisible people. But maybe because I got some chicken blood in my eyes that day, I also started seeing weird things. For example, when walking alone at night, I would always feel like someone was watching me from behind. And I also clearly saw some invisible people that Yang had seen before. I chose to ignore all of it, as if I didn't see anything, so my life would continue peacefully, next to my son and his. It was the terrifying story of the sudden and unexplained deaths of the guys in my group. They were so well known that people believed my village was cursed. In the day, I had a date to drink with some friends, An, Yin, and Gao. After drinking until we could no longer see the sun, we split up and went home. Because An was the closest person to Yin's house, An took the initiative to bring Yin home. "You are too drunk. Let me take you home." Even though Yin was drunk, he refused An's kindness and asked to walk home alone. "I can't get drunk. You can rest assured. I'll go home. Goodbye, see you tomorrow." An was extremely worried about Yin, so he followed him quietly for a while until he saw Yin turn into a familiar alley. Yin walked into the residential area. He lived alone in a small 20 square meter room. He worked and supported himself. As soon as Yin got home, he sat down on the bed, took off his socks, sighed and rested. He had a bad habit of soaking his feet in hot water at night to relax his muscles and help him sleep better. So in the night, as usual, Yin soaked his feet in a large basin of water, comfortably enjoyed life, and went to bed. But we hadn't been able to contact Yin since the day, so all of them concerned went to Yin's house to check. An eagerly knocked on the door and called out Yin's name, but Yin did not respond. Because Yin lived alone here, An was worried and impatient. He didn't know if Yin had any problems in the room or not. An was standing thoughtfully when he felt water under his shoes. We immediately bent down to take a look and discovered that water was pouring out of Yin's room and spilling into the hallway. We all had a bad feeling in our hearts, so we broke the door and rushed in. When we entered, there was an unpleasant stench and the entire room was dark without a light. The gloom in Yin's room made us doubt his safety, so we all went straight to Yin's bedroom to check it out. We gently pushed Yin's bedroom door open and entered. Unexpectedly, we discovered a painful story. Yin had been lying motionless on the ground for a long time. His face was still in the basin of water. His body was already cold. An panicked and stood immovably on the spot. I and Gao hurriedly picked up Yin and checked his condition. Unfortunately, when we found Yin, he had died of suffocation. The second terrifying event occurred to Gao. Gao received notification that the item he had ordered from abroad had arrived, and he needed to go to town to pick it up. Gao hurriedly put on his coat and went outside, without realizing that the god of death was waiting for him. Gao's parents saw that it was dark and the road was dangerous, so they advised him to go tomorrow morning. However, Gao reassured everyone in the house by promising to return soon, and he was very confident in his steering. His wife stood at the door to see him off, always reminding him to be careful and return home early. Gao hummed to let it go and then hurried away. Looking at Gao's back, his wife was a little sad in her heart but didn't know how to describe it. Gao left the house, taking the familiar village road he used to take. He recalled his family's advice to drive slowly. It took a long time to get to town now, so Gao devised a plan to take a shortcut. The scene was dark now, and only the sound of Gao's car could be heard throughout the forest. Gao's car broke down while he was driving on the road, and the speed suddenly became faster, making it difficult for him to brake. Gao tried to control his car, but nothing could slow it down. The car was getting faster and faster, making Gao very nervous. Gao suddenly saw a sign in front of him. He realized that he was entering an area under construction. A forbidden sign appeared in front of him. Gao swerved to the side as a reflex to avoid the sign. Everything happened so quickly that Gao couldn't keep up with the pace and handle the situation in front of him. A loud noise rang out. Blood spurted out and Gao's head was severed in an instant by a rope. Gao and the car crashed to the ground, splashing on a nearby lawn. Gao's entire body was immobile on the ground. The road construction workers returned to work in the next morning. They were alarmed when they discovered the bulletin board and the rope had broken, leading them to believe that there had been an accident. The worker was horrified to discover Gao's body when he looked to the side of the bush. His body was covered in blood and turned into white. The scariest thing was that his head was severed. It looked so scary. A month later, when everything had calmed down, the next scary thing happened to An. In the day, myself and An went to the market to buy some things to visit the graves of our two friends. By chance, we came across a fortune-telling stall in the middle of the market. The fortune-teller invited us in to look at some of the lots, but An pulled away my hand because he was not a superstitious person. But the fortune-teller kept calling us, and his voice was so urgent that the two of us noticed and decided to go check it out. An coldly looked at the fortune-teller, wanting him to tell his story quickly so that he could go shopping elsewhere. He pointed at An and said, "You are haunted. You need to buy my charms to wear around your neck to exorcise evil spirits." An didn't hear him finish the foretelling and left angrily. He told me that the fortune-teller now only cheated and scared children, and he didn't want to hear anything else. The old fortune-teller still called An back, telling him to stay away from lakes, rivers, and streams if he wanted to live. "If you don't believe me, you will only die." An calmly smiled and stated that such things didn't exist in the world. Then he invited me to join him at the bar for a few drinks tonight. I didn't think much of it, nodded in agreement and discussed with Anne about tonight's drinking party. The two of us quickly forgot the story which the fortune teller told. In the evening, like the old time, I met Anne at a familiar bar where we used to drink. We drank together until late at night. Because both of us had a good drink, even though it was too late, we still didn't feel drunk. I saw Anne off for a while because our house was on the same road. Two of us passed a dike in the village, chatting happily as we were walking. When Anne reached the middle of the dike, he suddenly heard Yin and Gao's voices calling to him, causing him to turn around. But the surroundings remained dark and no one was present. I was surprised and asked Anne, "Hey, what is going on?" Anne immediately inquired as to whether or not I had heard anyone calling. I looked at Anne perplexedly. His face was now filled with panic expressions, and he was adamant that he had seen Gao and Yin. I immediately reassured Anne that it was possible that he was drunk and might have misheard something, so I took him home. When Anne got home, his face was pale. I was worried. After dropping Anne at his house, I then returned to mine with a peace of mind. A few days later, we heard that Anne had gone missing after drinking with me, so the whole village organized a search. Anne's family also informed the police, but nothing had changed. I too was heartbroken and terrified, recalling the fortune teller's words to us and knowing that they had come true on Anne. At the same time, the village's sewer system unexpectedly broke down, preventing water from entering the field. People suspected that it had become blocked. As a result, when the blockage was discovered, the workers broke the water pipes and discovered a horrific scene. It was terrifying because there was a dead body in the sewer. The corpse was decomposed and gave off a strong smell, which was the reason why the sewer pipes were blocked. It was scary that the body was Anne's. It turned out that he slipped and fell into the sewer and got stuck there in the previous night. I was shocked when I realized that the fortune teller's words had come true. For many years, Mr. Congo and I worked as shippers. Even though it was snowing fiercely all day, we had to keep working. Mr. Congo was normally the driver, and I merely followed the car because he had been familiar and acquainted with the route for many years. The route was still rather long, and the weather was quite bad. So I suggested to Congo that we find a motel to rest, and then went the next day. But Congo was still extremely keen to keep up with the shipment. The snow was growing deeper and it was growing darker. After driving for a while, we stopped to refuel the car. Mr. Congo forced me to change the driver and I drove to let him rest. "Hey, you drive. I'll take a nap. If anything, wake me up." I was a bit annoyed because he refused to stop to rest. Moreover, he forced me to be the driver. He smoked a cigarette and said that the section of the road was supposed to be frequented by wild animals, so we couldn't stop for long. After hearing this, I was also a little embarrassed, but at the same time I still felt very sleepy. The road was quite deserted at the moment. The area was quite far from the residential area, so it was also gloomy. Then I realized I wanted to use the toilet, so I requested for him to pause for a moment. He accepted to stop the car, but he still did not forget to remind me to be careful and quickly get back into the car. "You have to hurry up there, and be careful of the dangerous animals." It was freezing cold. I stepped out of the car and I went around to the back to go to the toilet. Suddenly I felt like someone was watching me from behind. I looked around but I couldn't see anything. In the car, Mr. Congo still kept urging me to hurry up, so I didn't pay any attention and kept going. I admit, it was interesting to go to the toilet in the snow. Sometimes I thought my little boy had disappeared. After I finished, I pulled up my pants and got back into the car, but I still felt uncomfortable because I didn't get enough rest and had to keep going. Suddenly I noticed a tall figure standing next to the car. When I looked closely, I was extremely scared because it seemed like a big non-human creature, but what could it be? Was it a big bear? Congo was urging me in the car, but he didn't seem to see the figure. Suddenly the figure turned around. I was terrified. The figure looked like a monster with tall build, the head of a pig, and sharp teeth. I was so frightened. I ran to the side of the car to find a way to climb into it. But at the same time, I saw another monster standing directly and looking at me. I felt regret when I didn't believe Congo. At the same time, my heart felt like jumping out of my chest. I was afraid the figure would pounce on me. At the moment, Mr. Congo seemed to have discovered something. He quickly backed up the car so that I could climb into the passenger seat. I was still scared and sweating excessively when I got into the car. Mr. Congo's expression was serious and silent. After I had calmed down, I asked Mr. Congo if he had seen the monster. Before I could finish my sentence, I noticed a large dark shadow in front of the car, at the end of the car's light. The pig-headed monster appeared again. The monster looked so ferocious. The monster was now standing right in front of our car. The monster howled a terrifying echo towards the front of the car, and I could clearly see the blue eyes. The eyes were emerged from the monster. Mr. Congo kept his spirits up and drove straight towards the monster. I really didn't dare to look at the scene anymore. I could only scream in fear. Strangely, under the light of the car lights, the monster was not standing there at all. Because I was shocked, I yelled loudly, and Mr. Congo annoyed me and reminded me, "Have you seen? The place is filled with monsters, and it almost chewed your head off!" I didn't have any blood on my face at the same time, since it was too frightening for me. It was the first time I'd witnessed such a horrific scene. So the car continued to run until it was almost morning. We didn't dare to stop. But we finally came to a halt. The station owner instructed us to go into the village. There would be food and a place to rest. Mr. Congo said that he would stay here to look after the cart and arrange a place to rest, and I should follow the old man in the village to get some food. Then, once we'd found a place to relax and finished packing, I immediately followed the old man to go into the village. I saw a lot of wild boars in the village, but strangely I could not see anyone except from the old man. Because I had a lot of curiosity, I asked the old man about the area. Maybe the villagers here knew about the monster. But the old man said that the area was very peaceful. "There are no monsters here. This is the most peaceful place in the world, sir." According to the old man, I was not asking convenient questions anymore, so I actively changed the topic to talk about other things. While we were talking, I suddenly saw a familiar shadow appearing in the distance. It was yesterday's monster. The monster looked at me and opened the mouth. The monster's mouth was full of fangs and its eyes were terrifyingly blue. I suddenly turned to look at the pig in the barn. They were strangely similar. The monster may be related to the village. I felt the place and the old man were a bit weird. Therefore, I made an excuse that I wasn't feeling well and needed to rest. When I arrived at the place, I hadn't yet taken any breaks. Mr. Congo urged us to leave the village because he discovered that the people here had very strange expressions. Then we immediately moved to the car. At that moment, of course, there was a man. He had shady intentions towards our car. Suddenly I noticed a crowd of additional men surrounding us, and they were aggressive. Congo said, "Whatever you need, we will provide. Please spare us." At the time, the old man who welcomed us completely changed his face and became sinister. He said that we had hit and killed a person in the village. He demanded compensation from us. I was extremely angry by this nonsense words, so I jumped out to solve it. But right after that, I got punched by one of them. At the time, a policeman appeared out of nowhere. He told the villagers to bring the victim out. Strangely, I saw that they were carrying a dead wild boar. We accidentally hit this wild boar last night. But why did they say we killed the people in the village? The policeman said that we must leave all our goods as compensation, and we must bury the dead pig in the area where we killed it. Therefore, we had to give in and watch them rob us from all our goods which were of great value to us. Then we quickly got into the car and left the village. It was a good thing that we kept our lives. We went back to the old road where Mr. Congo said he crashed the car into the wild boar. You go and bury the pig. They were not human. It is best to do what they say to be safe, said Congo. When I looked closely at the pig and recalled the monster's face, I had a little doubt about Mr. Congo's statement. Congo said, "The villagers were these pigs." After listening to him, I couldn't believe it. I was surprised and I asked him if he was being neurotic. So he angrily tapped me on the head and told me to hurry up and get out of here. "We're in a ghost land. I think the story is just a rumor. I don't know if it's true. Hurry up! Get in the car and I'll tell you more." When I was digging, I thought if there was such a scary land in this world. Could a wild boar turn into a human? Later, Mr. Congo told me that the legend of the area was about many terrifying things, like wild boars turning into people, and that he thought both of us were very lucky today. We were able to return safely home with our lives intact. This was a story that happened to me and my wife a few years ago. At the time, to secure a source of income for both of us was extremely challenging. When I won a big project, my wife and I immediately rented a small apartment to stay in temporarily. But since moving into the apartment, my wife often had nightmares. In the middle of the night, she kept waking up from a nightmare that kept repeating night by night. Because of lack of sleep, my wife fell seriously ill. I was curious, so I asked my wife about the dream she so often dealt with every night. My wife honestly recounted that every night she would see herself being chased by a group of people in the alleyway leading to an apartment complex. The road was dark, she couldn't see her surroundings clearly, and the air was extremely cold. My wife tried everything to be able to escape the strange pursuit, but could not get away. This group of people were very large. Their movements were also extremely agile. They were only a few feet away from our wife. Every time my wife turned her head to look, she saw a group of people with white eyes, black faces and sharp fangs chasing her as if trying to catch her, and always while having sinister smiles. They chased my wife into a large but old and dilapidated building. My wife felt this building had a familiarity since it looked like the building that my wife and I were renting, but the atmosphere was unusually cold and gloomy. Despite the chill that gnawed at her skin, my wife ran a long way to the middle of the building. She continued to run for a while when she hit a dead end. She had no choice but to hide behind a large plasterboard to distract the mysterious people. By the time the group of people could come, my wife was already hiding. Taking advantage of the time they were still busy looking for her, my wife slowly turned around, stepping out of the plaster wall to find a way of escaping. Hearing the footsteps, this group of people turned to look in that direction, seeing my wife escaping, and then immediately chased after her. The sound of human footsteps echoed throughout the building with my wife's gasps and screams for help. My wife kept running and eventually found an abandoned room in a corner which was pitch black with no sight of what was inside, looking both mysterious and dangerous. My wife struggled to look around, wanting to find herself some light glimmering in this dark space, but she didn't know which way to go. Seeing that the group of people was about to catch up with her, she took a risk and entered the room to hide. My wife huddled in the dark room. Her whole body trembled from fear and the cold air inside. She only knew how to hold her breath and pray for the group of people not to find her. Suddenly, at that moment, behind my wife came the sound of footsteps rushing towards her. After a while, the group of people also found my wife. They immediately looked inside and looked at my wife, causing my wife to panic, jumping all over her and screaming. They rushed to each other, surrounding my wife. They reached out their hands as if to grab my wife and take her away. My wife was very scared, trying to find a way to escape, but now she couldn't move anymore. My wife's whole body paused as if frozen. She could only raise her hand to cover her face and scream for help, but got no response. She finally woke up. Since then, my wife's health had deteriorated. She often fell ill. But even so, she still tried to take good care of me so that I didn't have to worry too much. I had to go to the construction site early every day to start work. The first stage was to dig the ground layer to start building the foundation, so the work was hard. As a deputy manager, I had a lot of work to do. I had to supervise the work progress of the workers here on behalf of my superiors. The workers here worked extremely hard to be able to hand over the project on time. I often stood outside and constantly urged workers at the construction site to work harder and faster. The atmosphere here was extremely tense. While the workers were busy digging up the ground, I walked around the workplace alone. Unknowingly, I saw a small snake being covered by a layer of ground all over its body. It looked so pitiful. I immediately ordered the excavator to stop working and find a tree branch on the side of the road to help this little snake out. I let the snake wrap itself around the branch and gently carried it to a safer place. I found a long lawn lying on the side of the construction site. I felt that the place was also quite stable, so I released the small snake. I stood still by the grass, watching the small snake creeping through the weeds and disappearing into the deep forest as I breathed a sigh of relief. After successfully rescuing the poor little snake, I immediately told the workers to continue their work, not forgetting to instruct them to stay aware, in order to avoid the same case as the small snake. Finally, I happily returned to the work site. For some reason, after releasing the snake back to its wildlife, I felt extremely relieved. That afternoon, I was also able to get home from work early. I had dinner with my wife happily. My wife's body had also reduced her fever a lot. That night, my wife also slept better than usual. But in the middle of the night, my wife was once again shocked awake. Her face was tired and haunted, not the horror like the previous days, making me extremely surprised. My wife said that she continued to have the same nightmare as usual. But this time, in the dream appeared a strange thing that helped her escape the pursuit of the mysterious people pursuing her. My wife saw that the mysterious group of people continued to chase her down the familiar dark corridor. This time she got used to the ways here, so she quickly found the old room to hide in once again. Like the previous nights, these people once again found her hiding in the room. They rushed in again as if to pull her out and take her away. These people had become more aggressive than before. They pressed her to the end. They climbed through the window and entered the room to capture her. She screamed in panic for a while when a huge shadow appeared, biting at the people here like a monster. It wasn't until this huge creature came in front of the room that my wife could see it clearly. It was a big, yellow snake that acted very aggressively. This huge snake tried to protect my wife. It consumed all those monstrous ghosts with one bite and swallowed them whole. These people, some of them who were wrapped tightly by the snake's tail, were eaten alive, looking horrific. In the blink of an eye, these monstrous ghosts had completely disappeared. After consuming all the ghosts, the huge snake appeared in front of my wife. It looked at her gently, moved its head to signal peacefully to her, then turned to the other way. My wife also inadvertently understood the meaning of the huge snake. She followed the snake to find her way back. When my wife got out of the building, she saw an empty lot. The houses here had been abandoned for a long time, ruined and very lonely. After bringing my wife to a safe place, the snake turned into nearby wild grass and then slithered through the grass, gradually disappearing. After a while, a white light appeared, shining directly on my wife's face, causing her to wake up. After listening to my wife's story, according to her description, I realized that the snake that saved her life was the little snake that I saved at the construction site. I reassured my wife with a few sentences and then told her the story about the snake I saved at work. My story made her breathe a sigh of relief. Since then, my wife had not had that strange nightmare anymore. My project was also executed smoothly and way faster than planned. Aki and Nara were a recently married couple. To live a more comfortable life, the two decided to purchase an apartment in the suburbs. Both of them were overjoyed because they had discovered a location that was both inexpensive and convenient for travel. Sweet happiness didn't last long, as both of them were subjected to a terrifying story. It happened just a few weeks after the two moved into this apartment. There was an apartment in front of their house that was said to be empty, but Nara had seen a woman standing in front of the apartment door several times. When Nara noticed it, the woman turned to face the door, mumbling something inaudible. Although Nara was concerned about this issue, because Aki was preoccupied with the game, he only said a few words of comfort to calm her down. "There's nothing where there are no strange neighbors." Thinking everything would pass, Aki unexpectedly met the woman after his overtime work and returned home late. As soon as he stepped out of the elevator, Aki noticed a woman standing in front of the door to the apartment opposite his. The woman stood motionless, her head against a door frame, muttering something that piqued Aki's interest. Her behavior was identical to what Nara had described earlier. He also purposefully moved closer to hear her words clearly. It turned out that the woman wanted to enter the house but was unable to do so. Aki wondered if it was because she hadn't brought her keys, so he asked her if there was anyone else inside so he could assist her in calling and asking them to open the door. When she heard that, the woman turned her head and looked at Aki, her face expressionless, and explained that she was the only one living here and that there was no key to open the door. With no other option, Aki offered to call a locksmith to assist in opening the door. Following that, he immediately dialed the repair center, explained the situation to them, then hung up and went home, leaving the woman outside to wait. After about half an hour of resting in his house, he heard a knock on the door outside. The locksmith asked who needed assistance unlocking the door as soon as he saw Aki. Aki also quickly led the man over to the opposite apartment to meet the woman, but she was nowhere to be found. The locksmith assumed she had already found the key and entered the room. So the locksmith sighed and walked away. What a waste of time, despite Aki's apology, and offered to reimburse his travel expenses, which he declined. Things began to become more terrifying and terrifying as the days passed. When Nara and Aki were fast asleep in the middle of the night, they both heard a voice outside the door. Due to the quiet of the night, a loud cry woke both of them up, especially the cry that sounded like a lament. which was very sad. Because it was unusual for someone to call the door in the middle of the night, Nara did not dare to go see what was going on, so she let Aki open the door himself. On his face, Aki appeared unconcerned, but he was irritated at being bothered in this manner. He rolled out of bed, grabbed a baseball bat, and walked slowly to the door. The closer he got, the clearer the cry became. When Aki arrived at the door, he didn't rush to open it, but instead looked outside through the binoculars on the door to see who it was. At first glance, it appeared to be the same woman he had seen the last time. This time, however, she turned to find his family. Even more horrifying, Aki could see the corners of her eyes and her mouth bleeding and a distressed expression. She seemed to be aware that Aki was looking through the binoculars on the door, so she sobbed even more and begged him to help her. When Aki saw the scene, he became so nervous and scared that he suffocated and backed away from the door. Fortunately, the woman did not move. Aki quickly dashed back to his bedroom. Nara asked who was outside the door after noticing Aki's pale face and knowing there was something scary outside. To avoid frightening his wife, Aki pretended to be calm, claiming that it was just a cat meowing. Nara felt much better after hearing her husband say that. There were no more cries outside. Nara went to bed right away after solving the problem, but her husband couldn't sleep. He sat with his back to the head of the bed, his mind racing over what had just occurred. Aki requested a day off from work on Monday because he was sick. When his wife left for work, he went straight to the apartment building's management office to inquire about it. As soon as Aki walked into the office, he yelled at the manager, "You scammed us! This apartment has ghosts! That's why it's so cheap, isn't it?" The manager didn't understand what Aki said, and he was perplexed by what Aki said about ghosts. Aki immediately informed the manager of everything that had occurred over the last few days. The manager appeared suspicious, but he maintained a serious expression and listened intently to what Aki had to say. The manager quickly took out a small notebook with dense notes, as well as a large number of contact information for people who used to live here. He checked carefully and immediately found a phone number of Taro, the former owner who used to live in the apartment across the hall from Aki. They hadn't seen him in the apartment in 2 months. The manager paused for a moment, recalling that the last time he saw a woman accompanying him into that apartment was 2 months ago. Linking the facts, Aki suspected that there was a problem with that apartment, so he devised a plan to visit it to ascertain the situation. The manager, on the other hand, disagreed with Aki because it was someone else's house. Aki did not have the right to enter on his own. The manager considered that even if the apartment had problems, the management wasn't responsible for them. Aki was disappointed and concerned as he walked out of the management office. As he sat at home, he began to consider a few things. He and his wife had used up all of their savings to buy this house, and they still owed a significant amount of money to the bank. So they couldn't just walk away because they were haunted. The more he thought about it, the more enraged he became, and he didn't want his life to be ruined as a result of these things. He also couldn't afford to waste time waiting for someone else to solve the problem. He noticed the crowbar in the corner of the wall as soon as he looked to the side. When he looked at it, he had an idea. He stood up and looked towards the crowbar. To find the truth, he did not hesitate to make amends for the damage of that apartment. Thinking about it, Aki grabbed the crowbar and proceeded to the apartment across the hall. Aki inserted one end of the crowbar into the door and then tried his hardest to pry it open. An impact force deformed the door lock after hearing a few clicks. Finally, it was opened. Aki kicked open the door to gain courage. The door swung open quickly and collided with the wall, causing the door frame to be shaken. At that moment, an object fell from the door frame and landed hard on the ground. Aki quickly picked it up and discovered it to be a bronze mirror. This item was used to expel demons, and it was frequently hung in front of a house. He returned his gaze to the room. The surroundings were dusty and the air was gloomy and ghostly. At this point, Aki noticed a faint odor, not too rotten but strong enough to guess it was the stench of corpses. When he discovered suspicious traces, he abruptly came to a halt in front of a wall. The wall was streaked with light red water that emitted a stench. Water stains appeared to be leaking from within this wall. Aki was terrified when he realized what was behind the wall, but he had no choice but to dig into it in order to get an answer. Aki used all of his strength to hit the wall with the crowbar, and each piece of cement quickly broke down. The peculiarity was the concrete layer was not hard or thick but rather a thin layer. After the outer layer was removed, a layer of granular black material appears. Aki quickly reached out to brush away the layer of black grains. Then he touched something very soft and sticky. Aki began to tremble in fear after touching something filthy, and his forehead was also covered in beads of sweat. He didn't dare to wipe with his hand anymore, so he took a crowbar and continued chiseling the lime on the wall to see clearly. After the layers of material fell away, a purple-blue hand appeared on the wall, showing signs of decay and looking extremely frightening. Because he was terrified, Aki immediately backed away, his entire body trembling violently. Finally, he had to try to hold back his vomiting and flee this apartment. The police arrived less than half an hour after Aki called them and sealed off the entire scene. They also discovered the body of a woman who had been dead for more than 2 months in the wall. After the police began their investigation, they were able to identify the perpetrator, who also happened to be the owner of the apartment, Mr. Taro. The deceased woman was his lover. According to the testimony, Mr. Taro inadvertently killed the woman with a knife due to a personal conflict. He attempted to conceal his crime by concealing her body in the wall. To keep the stench at bay while hiding the body, he applied a layer of activated bamboo charcoal to the surface. As a result, when Aki punched the wall, the black granular soft substance that appeared was activated carbon. Aki later thought of it, perhaps because he was afraid of the witch's vengeance, so he attached a bronze mirror to prevent the woman from entering his house. Immediately after Mr. Taro's crimes were exposed, Nara and Aki no longer saw the woman's ghost. However, the apartment opposite their house was still sealed off and silent, sometimes causing them to live in fear. A long time ago, in my village, a strange thing happened. Originating from the reclaiming wasteland by the edge of the forest under the borders of the village chief to build an administrative office. The digging work went quite smoothly and without any problems. According to the plan, 1 week later the construction team must complete the work, so the work was in a very urgent situation. The voice of the supervisor urging and pressure from the village chief on the workers here made the atmosphere extremely tense. During construction, suddenly the group of workers accidentally saw a strange object lying deep in the ground. Looking from afar, it was no different from an antique chest. Seeing that, everyone discussed digging it up to see. But the more people dug, the more they suspected that it was a coffin. The construction team began to vigorously dig up the pile of dirt to see what strange buried things were underneath. After a while, workers unearthed a sizable wooden coffin that looked old, making everyone's faces pale with fear. After a while of digging, workers discovered not only one wooden coffin, but also 5 identical wooden coffins arranged against each other. By looking at it, everyone knew that these coffins were not normal, so they discussed calling the Feng Shui master to come check it out and give advice to the people in the village. After a while, the Feng Shui master also came. He was eccentric, but in return, he was a person with high spiritual ability, so everyone in the village respected him. This area had a lot of yin kui. It looked like something bad was about to happen, he said. As soon as he finished speaking, suddenly the ground shook slightly as if something had just escaped from there. While everyone was bewildered, the old Feng Shui master also approached them. Everyone in my village was worried, not knowing what the hell was going on, and kept asking the Feng Shui master. However, he just silently turned his glasses and looked ahead. Oh my gosh, this was a scary curse. He said that these 5 coffins were used to bury 5 people to protect the village's dragon veins, so digging it up would put the whole village in danger. The Feng Shui master immediately felt the seriousness of the incident and shouted, "Quickly, stop the construction immediately!" After thinking for a while, the Feng Shui master immediately told everyone to bring these 5 coffins back to their original position and bury them as they were at the beginning. Otherwise, every year, my village would have 5 people die. Everyone was worried, but they could not stop the construction. This was the order of the village head. While the workers were stirring and discussing, the village chief came and asked everyone what happened. The workers told everything to the village chief and then advised him to stop the construction work to put the 5 coffins back to their original positions. But he didn't seem to agree. He shouted loudly, telling the construction manager how stupid it was to listen to an older man's hoax. The village chief at that time thought that it was necessary to speed up the construction progress. Because they were frightened by the original words, everyone immediately went to persuade the village chief to bury the 5 coffins. But the village chief firmly disagreed because his superiors supervised this construction project, so it couldn't be delayed another day. Seeing that the village chief was angry, the workers immediately ignored the advice of the Feng Shui master and sent a car to deliver 5 coffins. The Feng Shui master saw this and quickly stopped. He rushed over, preventing everyone from carrying the 5 coffins away. But not only was it unsuccessful, but it also made the atmosphere noisy and uncomfortable. So the construction manager immediately ordered the workers to take the Feng Shui master elsewhere. But no matter what, he still refused to go. The older man watched the car carrying the coffins and was extremely scared. The older man shouted in fear, his mouth constantly repeating the sentence, "Oh my God, this village would be in trouble! This village would be cursed!" What the Feng Shui master said was immediately considered crazy. No one cared about him anymore. The next day, a man who was also a worker in the construction took advantage of his leave to go to the pond to catch fish like every other day. He tried electric fishing at the friend's advice in the group to catch fish faster and more, but for unknown reasons or carelessness, his electric box was short-circuited, causing him to be electrocuted, and he died on the spot. His body was later found at the edge of the pond 3 days later. A few days later, another worker in the village on his way to work accidentally passed the bend where 5 coffins were buried. Although running at a rather slow speed, for some reason when he was cornering, his car lost direction, causing him to fall to the ground. The fall caused him to hit his head hard on a large rock on the side of the road, traumatic brain injury and death on the spot. Since then, another person, who had also been a construction worker, whose family was not peaceful, often quarreled with his wife. On a night of arguing, the couple was bored. He left his home to the garden alone to calm down. After waiting for a long time, the wife did not see her husband in the room, so she had a feeling that something was not good and went out to see. Unexpectedly, when she had just arrived, the husband had hanged himself. He also didn't leave the last word or any suicide note. There were 3 funerals in my village in just 1 week, causing the whole village to be covered with mourning and death. People in the village began to be curious about the 3 deaths of the workers and suddenly remembered the words that the Feng Shui master said the day before. Everyone knew that it was the curse of the 5 coffins applying on the village, so they felt extremely insecure. The 3 victims were all construction workers in our team. I thought that curse caused it. Another person said that currently 3 people had died, so there would be 2 more. If not resolved soon, it was very likely that the same thing would happen. So they decided to go to the village chief together to ask to bury the other 5 coffins back to the old place. People gathered in front of the village chief's house, very crowded, shouting and banging on the door loudly. The village chief heard the commotion and came out from inside the house. His face was both annoyed and angry, not knowing who made a mess at his door. As soon as they saw the village chief, the people in the village booed, blamed the deaths of the 3 people in the village on his cause and demanded that he pay for their lives. But the village chief felt that this was nonsense and myth. He kicked them out and threatened that he would not pay them if they rebelled. The people in the village at that time felt disgruntled, but couldn't do anything else. On the way back, they talked gloomily, discussed, and pulled over to the Feng Shui master's house to ask him how to solve the curse. Everyone thought nothing of it, immediately rushed to the Feng Shui master's house to ask for advice. After knowing the matter, the Feng Shui master immediately reproached. His face was extremely indifferent, as if he did not care. Some people even came in front of him asking him about the identity of the next person who would die. The old man immediately washed his hands in innocence, not caring about it. His attitude was extremely frightened.
You people, go home, please. I don't know anything. Don't bother me.
So the villagers tried to convince him to give them advice, but it was no use. The older man shouted loudly, saying that it was difficult to stop the curse. It was too late. Many more people would die. The people in the village looked at each other helplessly. Could there be no other way? The atmosphere was quiet when the Feng Shui master suddenly said that there was still one solution, but there was a very high price to pay.
For the sake of the villagers, I would use this method. Everyone just needed to do what I say to break this curse,
he said. A few days later, the 4th worker lost his life while doing drugs. The 5th person to die was a worker who drove to bring 5 coffins. The sad thing here was that 1 day later, the Feng Shui master also died while sleeping. The villagers held a funeral for him. Everyone sympathized with his sacrifice. It turned out that the method of breaking the curse of the Feng Shui master was to use his own life in exchange for others. 5 coffins would be buried under the execution area where the prisoners were executed to ensure the Yin Kui had the most. And the 6th coffin buried with and on top of those 5 coffins was the coffin of the Feng Shui master.
House number 27 and the legend of the immortal man.
Lunch is when the headquarters is at its loudest, as everyone gathers in the dining room. Boss Lu Feng and Captain Chow were also here for lunch. Everyone started chatting with each other. After stressful working hours, only after lunch, Boss Lu Feng can relax a bit. Everyone was talking happily when suddenly Captain Chow saw a policeman sitting behind him. It was Vice Captain Yin of 702 headquarters. Captain Chow and Boss Lu Feng started to talk about the recently solved case led by Vice Captain Yin. Captain Chow was angry because he was on leave at the time of the case. He couldn't accept it. It was said that it was a severe case. Boss Lu Feng suddenly laughed and teased the captain that he should be lucky that he didn't take on the case. The whole team was bewildered and didn't know why the boss said that. It was on a break, so Boss Lu Feng also told the team about the compelling case. That day was like every other day at the police station. There were hardly any severe cases, so everyone was playing cards together. Suddenly, the phone rang. Everyone also told each other that hopefully it's not the phone to report the crime. But when the policeman answered the phone, the caller's announcement from the other end startled the officer. This policeman was Yin, the vice captain of the second team, because Captain Chow was on leave. His team would be on duty that day. Seeing Yin's panicked expression, his teammates also wanted to know what was going on. Yin sighed. It was a murder case. Someone died. His face looked grave, and he told his teammates to get ready to go to the scene. At that point, the teammates still didn't know what was going on, so he asked for more details. However, Vice Captain Yin's face suddenly turned grave. He just said that there was a murder and they needed to leave immediately. The whole team started in the afternoon, but at night they had not yet arrived because the scene was a suburban house. The car drove a bit more when it was already dark, and they reached the place where someone reported a murder. That was a spacious house, and around it were also large and beautiful houses, but there was no sign of anyone. They did not know who reported the crime. Mr. Yin and his teammates held flashlights in their hands because this area had almost no streetlights. In the past, this area was a place for nobility, but many things happened, so people abandoned it. Many of these houses were even abandoned. Mr. Yin felt very curious, not knowing who reported the crime because the scene seemed so quiet, as if nothing happened in the area. He double-checked. It was house number 27, as the reporter said on the phone. Mr. Yin's teammate tried to open the main door, but it seemed to be locked. Mr. Yin said they couldn't just break in like that, and couldn't break the door and affect the surroundings. They discovered a small window located not very high up, so his comrade decided to climb inside through the small window. It was pitch black inside, so his teammate couldn't see anything. Below, Mr. Yin still reminded his teammate to be careful, and after entering, he quickly opened the main door. The policeman slowly climbed inside, but everything was too dark. Suddenly he slipped and fell to the floor. Beneath his feet was something very slippery, so he couldn't support his feet. Suddenly he realized on the floor was some very foul-smelling liquid. He quickly shined the flashlight on the hand he was leaning on the floor to see what it was. As soon as he shined the flashlight to look at it, he was amazed. There was fresh blood all over his hands at that time. Only now did he shine the light on the floor, which made him panic even more. The whole floor was smeared with blood. Blood was everywhere. Hearing the screams and the strong impact inside, Mr. Yin was also highly alarmed. At this time, Yin ordered the other policeman to break down the door immediately. They tried to kick and break the door, but the door was solid. It took more than a few minutes before they were able to break the lock and storm inside. When they got there, the four of them were surprised and a little scared. The floor was covered with fresh blood. It looked like murder just happened. The policemen were scared. With such a large amount of blood, there must have been a terrible murder here. Suddenly, Mr. Yin's teammates saw a door. There was also a lot of blood, so the team decided to go in there. Before going to the place, suddenly he saw a boy running very fast past through the door. The policeman was amazed because there was a murder here. Why were there children running around like that? He suddenly raised the gun reflexively just in case. Seeing that his comrades were on the defensive, Mr. Yin rushed to see the situation. Vice Captain Yin ordered everyone to prepare to raid the inside of the room and then slowly move towards the door. But everything inside was perfectly normal. They shined the lights around to get a closer look at the room. That was just a standard room. There was no trace of a fight or blood here. Vice Captain Yin ordered a search around the room to collect evidence. After searching for a while, Mr. Yin suddenly saw a strange picture hanging on the wall. It was a family photo of a husband and wife and their twin sons, but the expressions on their faces of the people in the picture were not happy. After looking around, there was no victim's body, so they decided to seal the scene first, and the following day it was easier to investigate. The following day at Headquarters 702, Vice Captain Yin held an emergency meeting. He let the person investigate that family and also knew the names of the family members. But the strange thing was that he did not find out who called to report the crime and where the victim's body was, so it was impossible to determine who the dead person was. That night, he was on duty as usual. The phone of crime reports rang again and again. Vice Captain Yin answered the phone. It was the same voice from yesterday. After receiving the call, Mr. Yin and a few teammates immediately returned to that house in the night. When they arrived, someone broke the seals and also opened the main door. The window didn't show any signs of breaking in, so the person didn't come in from the window. But the main door didn't show any signs of being vandalized, so how could he open it? Seeing that everything was too suspicious, Vice Captain Yin told everyone to prepare their weapons in case it was the culprit. They went inside and stayed alert because it was very dark inside, easy to ambush. The strange thing was that the blood on the floor had disappeared. Instead, there were only scratches as a fight happened. At this moment, the policeman suddenly heard a strange noise coming from behind. He immediately went back to check and saw a baby's tricycle rolling on the floor. When he turned around, it also stopped like it was looking at him. He found it odd, but Vice Captain Yin urged them to go up to the inspection floor. The team began to slowly make their way upstairs to look. The house was pitch black, but the moon was bright enough for them to walk up the stairs. As soon as they got there, the policeman in the lead suddenly panicked because the tricycle from earlier was rushing from upstairs towards them. They quickly ducked to the side so that the bike could plunge down the stairs. The bike went down very quickly and broke as someone pushed it down from above. At this point, they started to sweat because there was something scary about this house. But as policemen, they had to do their duty and went upstairs. But what was in front of them scared them even more. In front of them was a man sitting neatly on a chair against a wall. Before they would react, the man disappeared right before their eyes. They were shocked as to what was going on, and the man from earlier looked a lot like the one in the family photo. The whole team was still bewildered when downstairs they heard the sound of footsteps walking on the wooden floor. They hurriedly looked down in fear that the perpetrator would return to the scene to check. But what they saw surprised them. Downstairs was a woman with 2 children, looking very similar to people in the other picture. Before they could be calm, the woman and the 2 children turned and looked up at them, their faces covered in blood, white, blood pouring out of their eyes and mouth, looking very scary. Before they could recover, the woman and the 2 children had disappeared before their eyes. Suddenly, the policeman closest to the top fell again, causing the 3 of them to fall from the top of the stairs. Vice Captain Yin and another teammate only had scratches on the skin. The policeman who walked first had suffered a severe head injury and was unconscious. Then they quickly left the house. Vice Captain Yin also took his teammate to the hospital. Fortunately, he was okay. But when asked about the incident, why did he fall down like that, the policeman was still panicking to tell. Just when everyone was still looking at the other mother and son, right behind them the strange man appeared again and reached out his hand as if to push the policeman. Because the policeman was so scared, he fell down and pulled everyone to follow him. Hearing this, Vice Captain Yin and his teammates looked at each other. They then rushed to the scene. At that time, people smashed a part of the house to search for the victim's body. As soon as Vice Captain Yin arrived, he was amazed. There were many people around, but no one could see inside except for the police. And what they had discovered on the floor made everyone in the team highly shocked. They stood still and pondered for a long time before the events in front of them. The bodies of the mother and 2 twin sons in the picture, as well as the souls they saw last night, they were soaked in a big pot and buried deeply in the ground. The strange thing was that their bodies didn't rot. They just looked like they were sleeping. So were the twins, but the pot was a bit small. How would all 3 of them fit in? Vice Captain Yin ordered their bodies to be brought back for forensic investigation to determine the cause of death. They quickly brought the bodies back to the headquarters. According to the initial autopsy, someone stabbed them with a sharp knife, which resulted in their deaths. However, it was amazing how they didn't have any wounds on their bodies. It was likely they healed on their own. The forensics team then showed the Vice Captain Yin the female victim's bone X-ray image. The victim's bones had many wounds, but it was showing signs of healing. After listening to the forensics, Vice Captain Yin wondered, how did that happen? The forensic doctor said that he had also heard of a method of witchcraft that could bring the dead back to life. And the way the woman and 2 children were soaked in a large jug of water was for that purpose. Hearing this, Vice Captain Yin also started to sweat because it was his first time encountering something like this. The forensic doctor said that he would continue to investigate. If there were any more clues, he would notify Mr. Yin immediately. Then something strange happened. Yin received an urgent call to the interrogation room. There was a suspicious man who asked to confess and asked the police to protect him. But for some reason he seemed to be very cooperative with the police. He said that he couldn't live in fear anymore. Only by going to prison would he be safe. Therefore, he would tell everything. He was a thief. That day, he directed 3 more guys who decided to break into house number 27. Those 3 guys covered their faces, held knives, and burst into the house because they investigated that the house was usually only occupied by 3 people, the mother and her sons. With the mother's fierce resistance, they stabbed her to death. Then they also killed both the boys. They took away all the money and jewelry available in the house. Just as they were about to escape, a man entered the house from outside. Seeing his wife and children die tragically, the husband was furious. 3 thieves rushed in to attack, but the husband beat them up. Then the husband stole the knife and killed them all. Blood filled the floor with blood like a sea of blood. That day, because he was the last thief standing guard outside, he was lucky to escape death, but then he was always haunted by the events of that day. Vice Captain Yin asked about the husband's appearance. He described the husband's figure, and the unique feature was that there was a mole above the top of his eyebrow. Vice Captain Yin asked him if he knew where the husband was. After his comrades were killed, he let people watch and knew the husband's area, but did not dare to approach. According to the thief's instructions, the police came and searched around the area. This was a wild mountain area. After nearly a day of pursuit and scuffle, the police finally caught him. Because the husband was very dangerous, the resistance was very high, so the police carefully escorted him to the headquarters. Arriving at the police office, he was still very loose and showed no fear in front of the police, making Deputy Yin very angry. But in return, just his sinister smile and tantalizing answers. He admitted to all the murders to avenge his wife and children that day, but he seemed very happy about it. After the interrogation, the police brought him to the scene to get evidence and reconstruct the scene. On the way past the prison, the husband saw the thief who was still alive that day. The thief was scared and trembled when he looked at him. The husband just looked at him and gave him an evil smile. His eyes seemed like he wanted to eat the thief alive. Just a few minutes later, the thief did something terrible right in prison. He cut his own neck and wrists with broken bricks, bleeding to death. He died in a kneeling position, as if he was confessing his crime and not closing his eyes. As for the husband, the police took him to the house where the murder took place. When he stood in front of the pot containing the bodies of the mother and sons, the police wanted him to reveal his motives for doing it. But in return, the husband just said it was a way for his wife and children to be revived and live by his side forever, and said the police didn't need to know too much about it. Right after that, the husband said that there was nothing left for him to stay here. He had had enough fun. With his attitude, Vice Captain Yin was also surprised. And in an instant, the handcuffs were quickly removed by the husband. In the presence of all the police, he didn't use any tools. Despite the surrounding policemen pointing their guns at him, the husband remained calm as if nothing had happened. After that, the husband just looked at Vice Captain Yin, and Mr. Yin's whole body froze and couldn't move. In the presence of all the police, the husband leisurely went upstairs. Vice Captain Yin and his teammates also chased after him and asked him to stop, but he didn't seem to care. He walked to the front of the wall and suddenly stopped. The policemen chased him, but there seemed to be an invisible wall stopping them. They couldn't believe their eyes, but it was true that there was something in front of them that couldn't go. At the same time, the husband suddenly put his hand on the wall. Suddenly, the wall turned into liquid. In an instant, he went through the wall like he was sinking into a puddle. The police couldn't give chase, so they shot at him. He disappeared into the wall, leaving only the bullet holes in the wall. After that, the policemen were able to approach Vice Captain Yin, checking the wall. It was still as sturdy as usual, and the bullets were still digging deep into it. Suddenly, the floor shook violently like an earthquake. In a split second, the police officers and Vice Captain Yin were back at the old place where the husband left the water pot with the bodies of the mother and sons. And that husband has disappeared since then. There was no way to investigate his whereabouts. Hearing Boss Lu Feng talk about this, the whole team was shocked because they couldn't believe it happened. Boss Lu Feng just smiled, left the table and said that anything was possible in this world. Captain Chow was very curious about the case, so he deliberately followed his boss to ask more about the woman's ghost and 2 children. Boss Lu Feng just sighed and said that it's impossible to revive the dead. As the ghost of the woman who called the police, maybe she wanted to stop her husband. Witchcraft always had its downside. If people could be revived, they couldn't return to normal. Boss Lu also revealed that the mysterious man also had many thrilling anecdotes. He had terrifying abilities. It was best not to investigate him. At some point, he would tell Captain Chow and the others more about him. On a particular day, Boss Lu Feng's room was hosting a visitor from afar, and Captain Chow was also summoned. Captain Chow arrived quickly, believing he was on an important mission. It was Captain Zhu, and he was in charge of the Desert Devil case at the time, Lu Feng said. He appeared to be very sociable, cheerfully shaking hands with Captain Chow right away. According to Boss Lu Feng, a tomb of an ancient tribe known as the Sandman tribe was discovered in the western desert area, and tomb robbers stole the treasures from within. Tomb robbers were currently fleeing to the city to seek refuge, and Captain Chow's team would require assistance from the local police. Boss Lu Feng appeared to be taking the case very seriously at that time. Captain Chow immediately obeyed orders. According to Captain Zhu's patrol and information intelligence, the police quickly discovered the thieves' hiding place and they immediately set out to raid it. After arriving, the police at headquarters 703 and Captain Zhu waited in ambush outside. Before the police could rush in, a man inside the house abruptly exited. His face and clothes were covered in blood. He appeared panicked and ran out without even looking at the police. He was apprehended quickly, but he continued to yell that someone was trying to kill him. "Policeman, help me! Someone wants to kill me!" Then another man chased him down with a knife. This man was extremely fast. Captain Chow tried to catch him, but he escaped easily. Then he began attacking the nearby policeman. He was so ferocious and obstinate that he appeared insane. He took a knife and stabbed the policeman, seriously hurting him. The policeman quickly opened fire and shot him twice in the stomach. He fell to the ground a little bit. Normal people wouldn't be able to withstand those 2 shots, but he still managed to stand up and attack the policeman aggressively, as if he didn't feel any pain. The policemen were well-trained professionals, but they were powerless against this guy. On the contrary, he still managed to injure many policemen. The crazy man fought back fiercely despite being hit by a bullet, which was unheard of for any normal human. Even worse, he spilled blood on a policeman's head with his bare hands. In this situation, Captain Chow attempted to attack as well, landing a powerful punch on him. Then Captain Chow gave a kick to his chin which seemed to hurt him. At the point, his body trembled and he appeared frightened. He screamed, his face was not human, and his eyes widened as if he had transformed into some demon. At the same time, Captain Chow also noticed something unusual about him, so he warned everyone to be extremely cautious. The man mutated into a wild beast. His eyes lost their irises and he suddenly seemed to have no idea what pain was. he was shot in the middle of the head from behind. Captain Zhu was the one who fired the shot. Captain Chow was surprised. "Why did you shoot him? He was an important suspect in this case." However, according to Captain Zhu, he was a danger because there were currently no police to control him, and the best way to deal with him was to be shot dead. Before Captain Chow could respond, he heard the police report from afar about the blood loss of the policeman who had just been stabbed by the thief. The captain immediately sent the injured policeman to the hospital. Captain Zhu abruptly told him to examine the face of the thief who had just died. Captain Chow was surprised after taking a closer look. The thief who was shot dead had the same face as the one who was being arrested. The other guy appeared to be very happy, with a satisfied smile on his face. "I finally escaped." Captain Chow began to suspect that Zhu was concealing something from them. When Captain Chow arrived at the investigation room, he immediately took out the thief's file to examine it. His name was Ming, and he had no siblings, so the man who had just died could not be a twin. So Captain Chow interrogated the deceased, but the other thief remained silent. Finally, he uttered only one sentence: that the devil sent him here. He said he tried to run away, but the devil was always watching and trying to kill him. "Those were the demons from beneath the tomb, and I had to do everything in my power to escape from them." Captain Zhu became enraged at this point and forced him to reveal the details of the grave theft. However, at first, the thief refused to speak. Then Zhu continued to lecture him on the law and regulations, implying that if he told the truth, he would be lenient. He claimed that he heard from an antique collector named Wang that there were valuable treasures inside the Sandman tribe's tomb, so he and his accomplice, Lin, followed Mr. Wang. Mr. Wang hired a guide because the tomb was in the middle of the desert and it was difficult to reach. But when they got close to the location, the guide refused to accompany them. Mr. Wang expressed dissatisfaction because he had paid him in advance, leading him to believe he wanted to swindle in the point. The guide stated that they could only be brought to here because if they went any further, they would be cursed by the tribe. "Didn't you know how terrifying this place was? I couldn't take it anymore. I could only take them to a certain point." Then he ran away with no turning back to accompany them. When Lin saw the guide's action, he was so afraid of being reported to the police, so he planned to kill the guide. Mr. Wang, on the other hand, quickly stopped him, believing that his fear was understandable. Lin then asked Mr. Wang about the strange tribe. What's the reason for people to be so afraid of the tribe? According to Mr. Wang, it was an ancient tribe that worshipped the sand gods and had a very strange custom. When the tribe's men reached the age of maturity, they had to enter the cave where the sand god was worshipped. Cries of desperation rang out from the cave. However, once they came out, they would become a completely different person. They became an invisible warrior, and swords could no longer harm them. Since there was no guide, they could only follow Mr. Wang because he had studied the tribe for many years. The closer you got, the denser the sand became, forming a layer of dew. However, by following Mr. Wang, they finally arrived at the cave where the sand god was worshipped, as well as the sand people's tomb. They lit torches and began to go deeper inside. There were already countless human bones scattered from the outside, and the space inside had a very unpleasant foul odor. The deeper they went, the more human bones there were. Perhaps they belonged to people who had come here to steal graves. After a long walk, they reached the end of the cave where there was an altar to worship the sand gods. On the altar, there was a stone box, the inside of which emitted a magical blue light. Mr. Wang reached out and removed it from the box. According to Mr. Wang, it was a Pisces pearl, a treasure of the sand people. The gem was extremely valuable. It was worth enough to feed 3 people for a lifetime. Under the torch, the gem radiated a lethal, enticing light. Mr. Wang quickly hid the pearl and 3 of them left cheerfully, believing that the theft was too simple. Mr. Wang led the way and they followed as they approached the cave's entrance when something strange happened. Suddenly at the cave's end there was the sound of footsteps stepping on dry skeletons and walking towards them. A person appeared from behind as they turned around. They became terrified as the person approached them. He looked exactly like Lin, except his face was lifeless and emotionless. Then he rushed towards them. Mr. Wang quickly turned around to see what was going on when he heard the sound of conflict. It all immediately came to a halt as the attackers stopped heading Lin and turned to face them. Now his face changed. His appearance transformed into Mr. Wang's. Even though they were terrified, they attempted to attack him with guns. Because of the constant frontal assault, it could temporarily slow him down, which was strange because even bullets through the head and chest did not cause him to fall. As a result, both of them decided that running was the best option. When Ming turned his head to look behind him, another figure appeared. And at that time, the guy who just appeared looked exactly like Ming, now both with expressionless faces. When 2 of them fled the cave as quickly as they could, Mr. Wang suddenly stopped, and what they saw in front of them terrified them. Strange-looking people began to emerge from the sand, resembling zombies. Perhaps they were the legendary Sand People. Surely it was the tribe of Sand People. How could they still be alive and emerge from the sand after hundreds of years? Ming was so terrified that he froze until Mr. Wang held at him to shoot, at which point he regained his composure. 2 people shot at them insistently, but it didn't work. Their bodies still bled like normal people, but they didn't feel any pain. Ming was so terrified that he froze, despite the fact that he had hunted for antiques a few times before, but the situation in front of him frightened him as well. One of them screamed and rushed to him. He was so terrified that he couldn't react. Fortunately, Mr. Wang helped him as he knocked the Sandman with the gun's handle. Even though his jaw was broken and twisted to the side, he continued to attack. Running out of options, Mr. Wang took out firecrackers from his pocket. As he started lighting them up, he told Ming to run as fast as he could. He lit the firecrackers and threw it at them. He ran away after throwing it, but Ming was still too shocked to walk. If Mr. Wang hadn't called, he would have been crushed to pieces. As he ran, he turned his head to see, but despite their bodies being blown up by bombs, they were still crawling towards him. Ming shot them from behind while they were running, and Mr. Wang continued to light more bombs. Another blew up to clear the way for them to run. Mr. Wang repeatedly exploded bombs to clear the way, but he couldn't hold out for long. They ran into an abandoned catacombs nearby. It was frightening that they were still outnumbered and being chased. At that point, on the inside was a dead end, and both of them believed they would die here. But fortunately, there was a large hole in the roof of the catacombs through which they could escape. Mr. Wang intended to climb out and drop the final bomb to bury the chasers. He helped Ming first and was still below to detonate the bomb, as the situation was extremely dangerous. After Ming climbed up to the roof of the catacombs, Mr. Wang threw the bomb at them. Fortunately, the explosion stopped them and buried some of them as well. Mr. Wang took advantage of the opportunity and climbed to the top with Ming. But just as Ming was pulling him up, a weight pulled him back. Mr. Wang trembled as he looked down at his feet. A Sandman grabbed his leg. Then he was pulled back. Unable to climb, and was forced to give up. He then detonated the bomb and died alongside all of them. Ming, on the other hand, began to run away and ended up walking for a long time. Ming suddenly realized that someone was following him. And according to him, his follower was one of them, and he wished to kill Ming in order to be the sole survivor. After the interrogation, Captain Chow felt that it was absurd. It was impossible to copy people's faces. However, according to Captain Zhu, the legend of the Pisces pendant which could copy anything existed. The treasure of the former powerful magic priest of the Sand People was entirely true. It was a true story, a legend in my hometown, Captain Zhu asserted. Captain Chow believed that the legend had caused Zhu to become confused between the present and the past. So Captain Chow went to the autopsy to get more accurate results. When he arrived, he hastily asked the forensic doctor about it. According to the autopsy, the person was a carbon copy of Ming. Even the blood type and moles on the body were the same. Captain Chow couldn't believe the results, even after hearing it from the forensic doctor. But the doctor thought that anything was possible, so he handed over the autopsy report to the captain for review. The thief Ming was then handed over to Captain Zhu, who escorted him back to the location where Captain Zhu was in charge. The collaboration had strengthened the headquarters relationship. After that, Captain Chow never saw Captain Zhu again. On the way back, he inquired about human cloning with his boss, Liu Feng. He said no one would know about it, but he once met two identical people in two different locations who were not related by blood. Captain Chow was intrigued by these two, but Boss Liu Feng simply stated that he only knew a little about them. Many years later, when Captain Chow took over as director and replaced Boss Liu Feng, the case of the Pisces pearls reappeared. The newspaper reported on the disappearance of a scientist who had come to explore the Sand People's tombs. The expedition's captain did not return, and no one knew where he was. The adventurers had been looking for the Sand People for several days at the time. Along the way, they discovered some abandoned and dilapidated catacombs. They noticed a lot of bones after looking around. One of them was holding a Pisces pearl. When the gem was brought back for research, they discovered that it had the ability to replicate an identical copy of anyone. The next day, the captain suddenly disappeared. He just left a note saying that people didn't need to find him. The captain and the gem simply vanished without a trace. There had been many policemen and adventurers trying to search, but all was in vain. There were many variations on the issue. It was said that the magician used the gem's power to travel to another dimension, and the people on the expedition changed as well. At the time, the captain and the gem vanished as well. Perhaps he went to another dimension. Everything came to a dead end, and no one was able to investigate any further. Hopefully, the mystery could be solved one day. A peaceful village suddenly became more bustling because of a strange case. Boss Liu Feng and Captain Chow were also notified and quickly showed up. When they arrived at the scene, they met the policemen at the village and heard everything again. The victim was a boy who was only 13 years old, and according to the policemen, this area frequently had similar murders lately. Boss Liu Feng also inquired more carefully whether these murders were the result of robbery or if they were being investigated for other reasons. However, nothing was suspicious. No property was stolen, the children died in the same manner, and the villagers often said it to be the result of evil magic. As soon as he said it, both of them were whisked away to the victim's home, which also served as the crime scene. Leader and boss Liu Feng were both taken aback by the victim's dead posture, which was out of the ordinary. The strangest thing was that the dumbbells are tied to the child's hands, which begs the question of why the perpetrator did the same, and the child's posture was also extremely strange. After observation, Boss Liu Feng also said that for some reason it related to the cause of the perpetrator's crime, because the dumbbell was possibly the perpetrator deliberately tying it to the ground and not wanting it to be tied to the child's hands. Boss Liu Feng decided to focus his investigation on the dumbbell. After careful examination, Boss Liu Feng ordered the boy's body to be brought down for further examination. The boy's body was slowly taken down, and there was no sign of any suspicion. Captain Chow approached and intended to examine the boy's insides, and after unbuttoning the boy's shirt, another strange thing appeared. Captain Chow hurriedly reported to his boss to see for himself. Both Boss Liu Feng and everyone present, after seeing the incident, were also very curious and a bit surprised. Underneath the shirt were some female overalls, which rural women usually wore as a bra. So why was this boy wearing it like that? The police chief of this area did not care much about the question. He said that due to the boy's gender, he dressed like that. But Boss Liu Feng didn't think so. He thought that all the strange things in a case were suspicious, couldn't be subjective. And after a scene inspection was completed, Boss Liu Feng ordered the boy's body to be returned to headquarters so that the forensic examination could be more thoroughly examined. The local police officer also followed along to the headquarters in order to investigate the case together, and everyone quickly returned so that the forensic analysts could soon examine the body. In the car, Boss Liu Feng asked about the previous cases, and was told by the police that the cases were very similar to how the crime was committed. And that police officer claimed it was because the children's families were members of a cult, which was causing all these problems. But Boss Liu Feng disagreed, and he said it was definitely an individual's cause, and blamed the police for taking the case lightly and didn't examine the scene carefully. Any case would have its cause, and it was impossible to unjustly blame anyone without fully investigating everything. Immediately the card returned to the headquarters. The forensic also had long-awaited orders. But the local police insisted that there was nothing in the small village for the perpetrator to commit the crime. Chief Liu Feng did not want to argue with him, so he had just asked them to hurry to the forensic room and listen to the forensic judgment. The forensic room at headquarters 703 was the most highly specialized forensic room in the entire organization. When they arrived, the forensic side was also nearing the end of the initial diagnosis. The policeman did not seem to believe what Chief Liu Feng said, so he was eager to learn the results. The forensic team discovered numerous suspicious items on the victim's body. Chief Liu Feng discovered many suspicious points as well, but he asked the forensic to speak carefully again to ensure that what he discovered was correct. Forensic examination had pointed out many singularities on the victim. The holes and the facial expressions of the victim was the most suspicious of all. On the victim's head there was a hole like a nail, and it seemed that when the boy died, the killer proceeded to crucify the boy's forehead. The boy's face was very pale and his eyes had dark circles, not as dead as reported. At this moment the policeman did not want to be said to be irresponsible, so he protested that the boy had just died this morning. The forehead's injury has been caused by the boy who fell before his death. But the forensic insisted that the wound was caused by a nail stabbing, and according to autopsy, the boy had died a day earlier and was only hung up today. After hearing the forensics judgment, the policeman expressed fear of being reprimanded, so sweat was pouring out of him. But Boss Liu Feng never reprimanded him and asked more about the boy's family situation recently. At this time, the other policeman reported that the boy's family had been going back to his hometown for 3 days and that the boy was alone at home. After hearing all the clues, Boss Lu Feng guessed that the camisole was not by accident. It certainly had something hidden behind it. And the dumbbell. There was definitely a mystery in the way of killing. This case wasn't simple. According to the subordinates, all of the children killed in the area were roughly the same age. So based on all the clues, this was definitely a serial murder case. But why kill these children? They had nothing to take advantage of. Their family was also very poor, so what was the point of killing them? With the police's suspicions, Boss Lu Feng became enraged, believed that all deaths had cause and that nothing was meaningless. After being blamed, the police took the serious action to investigate the incident and together with Boss Lu Feng summarized the location of the murder and the perpetrator's general method of committing the crime. Finally, Boss Lu Feng ordered Captain Chow to quickly open a meeting with all the police in charge of the case. And the boss also ordered all the policemen in the area to attend this meeting. He wanted to coordinate to resolve the murder soon. After just over an hour, all gathered at the headquarters, waiting for Chief Chow to preside over the emergency meeting. He has prepared a map of the area where the recent murders happened. And all cases had one thing in common. It was that they were all about a month apart, and the victims were boys aged 13 to 15 years old. When the perpetrator commits the crime, they would dress the victim in women's clothing. And the crime points were not far apart. The perpetrator was likely to be in the central area, and the culprit was definitely only one person, and according to judgment, he would not be able to move far after causing such crimes, at least until next month. So it should make it easy to localize the area where the culprit was hiding. Because of the professionalism of the 703 investigation team, all the policemen in that area felt very awe-inspiring and delighted that they would quickly catch the killer. Boss Lu Feng immediately ordered the dispatch of the investigation squad, led by Captain Chow. After multiple investigations and ransackings, there was only one house that remained suspicious. All were consistent with those mysterious cases, so Captain Chow reported to Boss Lu Feng that the gun was used to enter the house. Not waiting for Captain Chow to finish his words, Boss Lu Feng was ready to raid, unable to let the suspect escape. Captain Chow and some of his teammates ambushed from behind. The back door was a tall, sturdy wooden door, but it was easily breakable as they went inside. There was a large courtyard inside, so they hid outside to observe the situation. After a while, without any movement inside, they immediately rushed in, and inside there was only one strangely dressed cloaked person sitting in front of an altar. He still turned his face calmly as if he didn't know what was going on. An old man looked old, his face wrinkled but frightening. Suddenly he jumped up and dashed away. He was moving so quickly that Captain Chow couldn't even catch up with him, but he hadn't gone far when he heard Chief Lu Feng's voice from the front yard. The suspicious man was apprehended in the front yard by Boss Lu Feng and his teammates after being rushed out. Captain Chow quickly removed his cloak to get a better look at his face, only to discover that he was in his mid-20s but appeared extremely old. Chief Lu Feng ordered an investigation into him. When he arrived at headquarters, he gradually revealed the heinous things he had done. During the interrogation, he appeared strange. He didn't act like a normal person. He claimed to be practicing a lifelong technique and that by killing 10 children, he could gather enough souls to do so. Wearing female clothing to increase the spirit of the soul, and after death, the soul would be held by dumbbells, unable to escape, and he would come to capture those souls. When he heard the murderer's sick words, Boss Lu Feng became enraged and ordered him detained immediately. Finally, the case would be closed as Captain Chow gathered all of the case documents. He returned them to Chief Lu Feng and gave them to the area police chief to keep on file in that area. He wanted them to keep it safe and to remember that every case required the police to focus their attention on it before it could be solved quickly. When Boss Lu Feng and Captain Chow left, he felt that humans were too cruel and that evil magic must be completely eradicated. Another mysterious case was closed, and the burden became heavier. At police headquarters 703, the whole team was busy with new cases, primarily petty thefts that happened regularly in town. Even Boss Lu Feng did not have time to rest. He sat down to review the murders. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. The person who came in was Captain Chow. He reported to his boss Lu Feng about the disappearance of many people recently in the mountainous area. Immediately, Boss Lu Feng ordered Captain Chow to prepare the entire team for the scene quickly. It was a severe case, so they could not take it lightly. Team 1 was ready to go to the scene. The incident was in a mountainside area next to town, so it didn't take a long time to get there. When they arrived, they knew that the person reporting the crime was a middle-aged man. His face was panicked and extremely scared when he said that his family members told him to go fishing but did not come back. He led the team to where his relatives said they would go and cast their nets to catch fish but disappeared. The water surface was relatively calm at this time. Boss Lu Feng and everyone felt the surrounding air was full of the smell of death. This lake was quite big and looked very deep, and there were almost no fish because the lake's surface was tranquil without a ripple. It seemed very strange. Boss Lu Feng asked a man when this lake existed. The man said that this lake just appeared recently, but this was the old chemical factory area. Immediately, Boss Lu Feng ordered the team to take measurements and look around this lake. Previously, this area was a chemical factory serving the army. After a landslide, this lake was also formed. Boss Lu Feng then ordered the police officers to get ready to dive to the bottom of the lake to investigate. At the command of Captain Chow, they would dive to the lake's bottom to find the missing people. They would bring knives to protect themselves. After hearing the signal clearly, they began to plunge into the water led by Captain Chow. The water of this lake was always calm without a ripple. Everyone in Boss Lu Feng stood on it waiting for news from Captain Chow. As for Captain Chow, after diving, he quickly reached the bottom of the lake, which was relatively deep. He glanced around at the bottom of the lake. It seemed that this lake had subsided and formed not long ago because the lake's soil had not yet wholly turned into mud and the pieces of bricks and stones built by the people before were still very much left. Captain Chow continued to swim around to check. The light down here seemed very weak. Suddenly, he saw something blurry in the distance. He decided to swim closer and discovered something which appeared to be someone's body. But why didn't it float on the water? Come to think of it, Captain Chow swam there quickly to see the situation. But when he swam closer to the place, he was amazed at what was in front of his eyes. At the bottom of the lake was a dead man, gripped by something, like the tentacles of a giant octopus. The strange thing was that even though he had been drowning for many days, the man's skin did not swell and looked like it had been sucked out of nutrients. Captain Chow was about to go over to see what had wrapped the man when something appeared beside him. It turned out to be another giant tentacle. It approached him from behind. He quickly glanced to see more clearly. That tentacle also had a lot of fangs sprouting out, looking scary. Right now, from below, similar tentacles began to appear, and the terrible thing finally came to Captain Chow. A series of other tentacles gradually appeared from the bottom of the lake. At that time, Captain Chow hastily turned his head and swam to the surface to escape. But unexpectedly, those tentacles were so fast, they grabbed his legs. Sharp fangs clung to his flesh, causing him terrible pain. It began to tear pieces of flesh from his leg as if it was food. Captain Chow reached out his hand to cut it off with a knife, but other tentacles surrounded him, wrapping around his arm. Fortunately, his teammates arrived in time to rescue him, cutting off those hideous tentacles. When the tentacles were severed, it spewed out a monstrous black liquid. The teammates were finally able to bring Captain Chow to the surface, free from the monster. Seeing that Captain Chow was seriously injured, his boss Lu Feng asked why, and was also very worried about him. Chow was panting now, reporting a giant monster below which had taken other victims to eat. What's more frightening, Captain Chow's condition was quite bad at that time. The places where those tentacles wrapped, the meat there was swollen like it was rotting. Both Captain Chow's legs and arms were starting to give off the stench of washed meat, and the pain was excruciating. After listening to his teammates' report about the incident at the bottom of the lake, Boss Lu Feng immediately ordered the team to prepare to drain all the water out of this lake. The whole team deployed the plan to destroy the monster instantly. In a few moments, the large capacity equipment used to draw water was delivered and ready to start draining. Many pumps were sucking the water below out of the lake. Boss Lu Feng and teammates were also waiting impatiently for what was in the lake after all. Because the lake was too deep, it took a long time to drain, and the sun began to set shortly. And the police officers also came to report to Boss Lu Feng that the lake water had been exhausted. As soon as they witnessed what was in front of them, the whole team was terrified. A monster or something terrifying appeared in front of them. It was huge. Its body was only made up of long tentacles and full of sharp fangs. It looked like a giant octopus, but that had no body part apart from the tentacles. Like tentacles growing from the ground, its tentacles still tightly wrapped the bodies of people who were thought to be missing. Their bodies were drained of their blood and dried up like mummies. The policemen grabbed their guns and started shooting at the monster because it had killed so many people. It must be destroyed. The bullets fired continuously at the tentacles, causing the monster to be injured and writhing in pain. Because it was so painful, it released the dead people on the tentacles, and the policemen took the opportunity to bring the dead people ashore. Then Boss Lu Feng ordered the implementation of Plan B. Large tanks of gasoline were prepared in advance and poured into the lake's bottom one by one. It seemed that Boss Lu Feng wanted to cook this giant octopus. They quickly poured gasoline down to drench the monster. Boss Lu Feng calmly pulled out a box of matches from his pocket and he began to light a match. Standing on high, he directly threw the match on the monster, and no one would be harmed by it again. Immediately the monster was on fire. It was in pain and writhed continuously with its tentacles. Its tentacles quickly burned away and its fangs slowly burned black and fell apart. Before long, the monster turned into a disgusting pile of black ash. And from the slime came a terrible stench like the smell of rotting meat, making everyone nauseous. After the monster was dead, the police officers were ordered to go down to the lake's bottom to look around. At the lake's bottom, scattered with many human bones, all the disappearances in the area were caused by it. Then Boss Lu Feng ordered the lake to be filled with soil. Finally, after dealing with the monster, the police returned the victims' bodies to their families. Also, they collected all the bones that were not intact for forensic examination to check the victim's identification. Boss Lu Feng also returned to the headquarters to review the case file. Captain Chow was seriously injured, but his bones were not affected and he was treated promptly. Although the wound has not healed, Captain Chow had also rushed back to work. He did not want to miss the cases. He brought his boss Liu Feng a report on the case of a giant man-eating octopus. This octopus had mutated and lived underneath the abandoned chemical factory. When the lake was formed, it was also when it emerged and resided below. The case was quickly closed, and this case was also listed as top secret. After this case, Captain Chow was rewarded for his bravery. However, there were still many strange cases ahead waiting for Captain Chow. One day, Mr. Chow was relatively free because there were no recent serious cases, therefore he had time to check some other case files. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise outside the corridor and he assumed that something was happening outside. He stepped out to investigate and he noticed two policemen escorting a tall, rugged-looking man. But both the policemen appeared to be having difficulty to control the man since the man looked to be quite muscular and furious. In fact, the man was capable of effortlessly knocking down a police officer with a little strike. Then the man used a slight yank of his arm to knock down the second officer. At the time, Mr. Chow was still monitoring things. The one policeman said that the man was arrested for attacking others in public. And just as the man was about to run away, he looked like a tiger. He was tall and extremely agile. However, as the man passed Mr. Chow only needed to use one attack to block the man. Mr. Chow threw the man more than a meter away where the man was detained by other officers. At the time, Mr. Chow and the man were face to face. Mr. Chow couldn't believe this man to be a nasty person. Mr. Yang, on the other hand, said that the man had seriously injured a large number of people on the street. Mr. Chow was surprised. He had no idea why the man attacked so many people. He was curious about this man. Despite Mr. Chow's questioning, the policeman said that the case was within his scope, so he did not want Mr. Chow to interfere. He claimed that the case was nothing more than a fight between opposing street gangs. For no reason, Mr. Chow felt that the case was not so simple. He was very curious about the man, so he invited Mr. Yang into his room to drink tea and talk. Mr. Yang saw the curiosity and enthusiasm of Mr. Chow. He didn't want to conceal secrets any longer, so he told Mr. Chow everything that happened on that morning. At the area of manager Mr. Yang, there were a lot of children sitting outside begging for food recently, and one of them was a child who lost both legs. The child was terribly sick. He had lost 2 legs and frequently sat next to the large wall and asked visitors for money. According to the man, he saw that the child was robbed from all his belongings and money from some guy. Therefore, the man went over to confront the thief, but he wasn't in the mood to answer any of it. So the thief said insulting things and told the man to get out of the way. But the man disagreed and asked the guy to pay the child back. In the end, the thief got angry and called out a few gang members to threaten him. They started cursing and threatening him. Then they wanted to teach him a lesson. They believed it would be simple to overpower this man. But this was no ordinary man. He was able to defeat the thugs with just a few hits. He proceeded to knock them out one by one. But in any case, he was outnumbered, which prevented his escape and ended up with him being assaulted and harmed by the pack of thugs. Even though he was restrained, he could still resist fiercely. The man was as fierce and tenacious as a tiger. The man used all means possible, from striking to biting, as he just simply refused to give up. After that, despite being injured himself, he defeated them all. Until the police arrived, he continued to beat them with no intention of stopping. The police had to try their best to prevent him from continuing the fight, after which they brought him to the headquarters. After hearing everything, Mr. Chow asked Mr. Yang if he could handle the case. Mr. Yang also said that they had seen beggars seemingly forced by a group of people, but they weren't able to investigate the location just yet. When the fight happened, Mr. Yang was afraid he would break cover and get attention from them, which could possibly make them change to another site to operate from. So the police temporarily arrested the man, and Mr. Yang also agreed that Mr. Chow investigate this case, because this neighborhood also had many other cases to deal with. After being authorized, Mr. Chow immediately went to see the big man. Mr. Chow brought him some food, and he made it clear to him that he had no bad intentions and that the police had no intention of accusing him of being a criminal. And because Mr. Chow admired the man's calm demeanor, he agreed to let him go. The man was Mr. Shen. While he was eating, he told Mr. Chow that he did not simply meet that poor child by chance. He had repeatedly dreamt of a strange child, and in his dream, the child urged him to go via a certain route to help his friends. And eventually, when he got there, he saw the other person taking advantage of the child to ask for money, so he intervened. When Mr. Chow heard this, he offered to help him with the investigation of this case, and they could accompany each other. Mr. Shen was extremely surprised and happy to hear this. He told Mr. Chow about his dream. In his dream, he saw a little boy. The boy was looking very vague, but behind him was a row of houses looking very old and shabby. There was a very large and tall brick chimney next to the row of houses. After Mr. Shen shared the details of his dream, Mr. Chow immediately thought about the place with the chimneys as described. After Mr. Shen had eaten his fill, he began to speak his mind, because he grew up in the working class area, so he also knew many places like the areas in his dream. Both of them began to discuss and come up with their own theories about what was involved with the case and the dream. Mr. Chow invited Mr. Chen to accompany him to the locations they had just discussed. Although he was surprised that a police officer requested that he go with him to investigate the case, Mr. Shen did not think much about it. Because of the children, they mattered to him. He was thinking this as they began to drive to various locations. Along the way, both were very focused to find the place with the chimney. Suddenly, Mr. Shen recognized something familiar because the place in his dream was, of course, hazy and impossible to distinguish. This familiar place was a row of old houses built with clay bricks and had a tall chimney also made from old bricks. Their cars soon arrived in front of the block, and Mr. Shen was also puzzled. But the closer he got, the clearer his memory became. The place looked exactly like in his dream. Mr. Shen hurriedly shouted for Mr. Chow to quickly stop. If they wanted to get to those houses, they needed to drive around a tall, dense lawn. Because the place was originally an abandoned area for a long time, it might be risky. As soon as the car stopped, Mr. Shen rushed out of the car and ran to the place he remembered from his dream. Mr. Shen seemed to not have time to explain clearly to Mr. Chow. As Mr. Shen suddenly rushed in, at that time, Mr. Chow also understood the situation, so he did not stop him. Mr. Chow chased after Mr. Shen towards the old houses. They were very quick to get to the exact location. The area was a row of houses built one after the other. They were very old houses, but all were uninhabited. They went around to investigate and discovered a suspicious man in front of an old house hidden behind the blocks. But as soon as he noticed someone coming, he hurriedly went inside and closed the door. Mr. Chow stopped Mr. Shen so that he didn't move. Otherwise, the enemy might run away. Finally, they discussed a plan to lure the enemy out of the lair in the safest way. Mr. Shen would ring the door to lure the guard out, while Mr. Chow would try to enter from another direction. Immediately, the guard had taken out his knife. He suddenly attacked from the inside. They were clearly hiding something, but with his agility, Mr. Shen quickly dodged the attack. When Mr. Shen was about to counterattack, Mr. Chow pushed down the guard from behind. Mr. Chow jumped over the wall and got into the yard as he helped Mr. Shen defeat the guy. Mr. Chow said the outside was under control as they quickly checked inside. They approached the courtyard, where they discovered an exceedingly ancient home full of chains. The door was locked from the outside, but the crying and groaning could still be heard from the inside. Mr. Shen used his remarkable strength to break through the door. The light flooded the dark room inside. At the point, Mr. Shen and Mr. Chow were both taken back by what they saw. Multiple children filled the house, all pale and dressed in filthy clothes, huddling on the floor with no blankets, and there was just a small amount of leftover food and water on the ground nearby. They must have been imprisoned here for a long time, since their expressions were filled with terror. The food was thrown on the ground. They had just a few potatoes and a little water, and they were all barefoot and covered with wounds. Mr. Chow calmed the children, and he told them that he was a policeman and they would all be saved. Mr. Shen went around the house to inspect. Suddenly he shouted to the surprise of Mr. Chow. Mr. Chow rushed to see what the situation was as he saw Mr. Shen holding a baby in his arms, a baby who appeared to have 2 broken legs. According to the children, the child was beaten, breaking both legs, and was often taken to the street to use for begging. But he never went to the hospital, and these days he slept for a long time without waking up. Mr. Chow immediately advised Mr. Shen that the child needed to be taken to the hospital for treatment since he didn't appear to be conscious enough. Mr. Chow and Mr. Shen hurriedly gathered all of the children and exited the home to get into the car. They took all the children to the hospital for a general checkup. Some children were almost exclusively malnourished and lacking in nutrients, but only the one with the broken legs was seriously injured. Mr. Shen saw this very child in his dream because it was now evident that the child was going to die and probably reached out in his dreams for help. Mr. Chow comforted Mr. Shen and said that the doctors report that the child was still alive and he would recover soon. Mr. Shen's face was so happy since he had feelings of sympathy for the child. All of these children would be taken to an orphanage. But Mr. Shen was unable to accept that the injured kid would end up in an orphanage. He offered to adopt the child, and he also thanked Mr. Chow for his faith in him. Mr. Chow also bid Mr. Shen farewell. Then he left, his face showing joy because of meeting a good person, that Mr. Shen. At the same time, the police surrounded and arrested the terrible people using children for their own selfish gain.